40. Hopefully everybody can see me and where necessary hear me. Yeah, good. Just to introduce myself, I'll remind people who the inspectors are. My name is David Spencer, alongside with my colleague on my right, Mr. Glenn Rollings. We are the two inspectors appointed by the Secretary of State to carry out the independent examination of the submitted plan. Hopefully everybody is here today for a resumption of matters relating to the policy framework for Gatwick Airport and allied to that the Council's proposal within the plan for the strategic employment site at Gatwick Green. We'll come on to the agenda shortly, but we've got some housekeeping things to deal with firstly. So can I just remind people to ensure that mobile phones are switched off or on their silent settings, please. Now, hopefully most people here have met or at least spoken to Charlotte Glancy, who's on my left, who's the programme officer who's assisting the examination process. Just a gentle reminder that if you've got any queries about the examination process, your first port of call is to speak to Charlotte, who's based here whilst we're sitting, and her contact details are on the examination website, where you'll also find all the examination material. I'll now invite Charlotte to just briefly take us through the important housekeeping rules whilst we're here in the Town Hall. Thank you, Charlotte.
Morning, everyone. This is just some reminders about the fire procedure. There are no scheduled fire drills, so in the event of a fire alarm sounding, please leave the building via the main spiral staircase and through the main entrance doors. Once outside, please turn left and make your way to the fire assembly point located beyond the Town Hall multi-storey car park on Exchange Road. If you're unable to use the stairs, please wait in the chamber and you'll be guided by a member of staff to the evacuation lift. These hearing sessions are being filmed and recorded to be later uploaded to the Council's YouTube site. So you should be aware that the Council is a data controller under the Data Protection Act. Data control during a webcast will be retained in accordance with the Council's published policy, and these hearings will be retained for at least 2 years. So anyone seated around the chamber and in the public gallery will be filmed by the automated camera system, and your image may be captured. Therefore, by entering the room, you are consenting to being filmed and to the possible use of those images and sound recordings for webcasting and or training purposes. I think everybody knows how to use the mics. Just press the button on the right-hand side. And the toilets are just out through the doors to the right-hand side. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Charlotte. As Charlotte's indicated, in terms of the recording of these sessions and participation, it's people seated around the table that I'll be anticipating hearing from today. So whilst these are public sessions and people are more than welcome to observe them, it's only those who've exercised their right to be heard that I'll be hearing from within this forum. And as indicated a moment ago, today's session we are coming back to issues relating to Gatwick Airport. And in terms of the agenda that's previously been circulated, the structure for today or this morning's session is we're going to first look at matters relating to policies GAT 3 and GAT 4 in terms of airport Gatwick related car parking and employment uses at Gatwick. And then we'll be resuming the discussion from where we left off on Thursday, the 23rd of November. And it's principally an opportunity to consider the Council's evidence provided within the York aviation paper and the submissions that have been made on that evidence and material. I then want to have further discussion around the specific boundary for the safeguarding areas proposed in relation to Manor Royal and the County Oak location. And then finally, we'll come on to policy GAT2, which deals with development within the safeguarding area. And then finally, policy DD5 on the aerodrome safeguarding. So hopefully everybody has come prepared with that in mind. And for the benefit of ourselves as the inspectors and for anybody who will be watching the recording in due course, can I now turn and invite those who will be assisting the examination process to introduce themselves, and can I start with who'll be the team for Crawley Borough Council this morning?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Anthony Masson. I'm a Senior Planning Officer at Crawley Borough Council. Alongside me today I have David Forsdick, KC, and Mrs Sally Lepage.
Thank you, and working our way round the table, so to the right of the Borough Council, I think this is Gatwick Green.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Tony Cross, and I'm on behalf of Gatwick Green.
Nick Mayer from Mott MacDonald, also on behalf of Gatwick Green.
James Pereira, King's Council, also on behalf of Gatwick Green. Thank you.
And John Williams from Steer on behalf of Gatwick Green.
Thank you, and then moving round onto the other side of the table for Gatwick Airport, please.
Yes, good morning. Richard Higgins for Gatwick Airport Limited, and David Ellis on behalf of Gatwick Airport Limited.
Morning, Tim Norwood from Gatwick Airport.
Heather Sargent, Council on behalf of Gatwick Airport.
Andy Hunt from Quad on behalf of Gatwick Airport.
Michael Rees, LRM Planning on behalf of WT Lamb.
Morning, Graham Keane, King's Council on behalf of Ardmore Development.
Morning, sir. Suzanne Holloway, Vale Williams on regard of Ardmore Limited, Land at Jersey Farm.
Good morning, sir. Tim North and Associates Limited, acting on behalf of Holiday Extras Limited.
Thank you. Can I just check within the room, is there anybody here from the Aurora Property Group? We were anticipating attendance possibly this morning. No, we'll see if somebody turns up. There is a nameplate reserved, so don't be shy if you are here. No? Okay. Right, well, we've got a lot to get through, so I'm going to press on then, please. So I'm going to turn to item 2 on the agenda, and this relates to our matters, issues and questions 5.11 through to 5.13, and I first want to pick up policy GAT3, which is Gatwick Airport related parking. And my first question directed to the Borough Council on this within the framework of our MIQs is whether in the Council's view or opinion anything has materially changed since the 2015 local plan, when I think it's a very similar policy for Gatwick airport-related parking was found sound as part of that process. Whether you're monitoring, and I note the Council has now provided the latest 2023 parking survey data as document GA26, whether that's indicating that there's kind of any issue with the policy in terms of its effectiveness, and then sort of replicate in terms of then replicating that and taking it forward now as policy GAT3.
Thank you, sir. I mean, very much. I think you're correct. It's a roll forward of an existing policy. The only change that we've proposed since the previous version is the introduction of an "and" between the two limbs of the policy. That is really in response to previous inquiries that came forward. I think through the process of those inquiries, it was agreed that both limbs of the policy do apply. However, we've added the "and" as really just to reinforce that point. So it's really a point of clarity, albeit I think it's widely acknowledged that both limbs did apply, and that was demonstrated through the inquiry process. With regards to the parking surveys, yes, Crawley undertakes the survey every year. We coordinate the survey on behalf of the other authorities. We work closely with Gatwick Airport on that as well, and they provide information to that survey as well. And I think, again, the clear message we've seen through the survey is there's sufficient capacity both on airport sites and off airport sites. There's not an issue in terms of the parking provision. We are finding there is capacity. Just in terms of your other point, I think you'd asked if there'd been any material changes since the previous local plan. In the council's view, there hasn't been. We believe the policy is operating well. It's supporting Gatwick in achieving their mode share objectives for sustainable transport. It's part of a wider process that aligns also with the Section 106 agreement between Gatwick Airport, Crawley Borough Council and West Sussex County Council. The other element of that strategy is the Gatwick Airport Surface Access Strategy, which sets out, again, it's a review of the mode share targets, and those targets are ultimately sort of, they will feed into the Section 106 agreement as that is reviewed. So I think that's hopefully.
Thank you. So if I could bring in Mr. North at this point, it's probably the reverse question to Mr. North then. So in light of the local plan inspector's findings from the 2015 local plan, the subsequent Section 113 challenge on the plan, the further planning appeals since 2015, why should policy GAT 3, as now submitted, be considered not to be sound?
Thank you, sir. I was not present at the last public inquiry into the GAT3 matters. I was present at the Section 78 appeals, and there are a number of issues which I believe need to be taken into account when looking at GAT3. And to actually say, if I can use my answer to you, sir, in the reverse, to say what it's not about. It's not concerned with assessing whether on-airport car parking is the most sustainable in terms of access to Gatwick Airport by private car. It may well be the most sustainable in certain instances, but there may be occasions where sustainability arguments justify an off-airport car parking location, particularly where that off-airport car parking site uses the traditional park and ride model, where a shuttle bus can take as many as 16 cars off the road in the immediate vicinity of Gatwick Airport, with obvious consequential benefits in terms of congestion and pollution on the neighbouring highway network. It's also, sir, not concerned with safeguarding land policy. That's a different issue, as I think you've rightly said. The SEA requirement carried out in respect of the previous version of the 2015 plan scored both on and off airport parking equally. Although I note the sustainability objectives have not changed, the Council has thought it appropriate to change the scores in some instances. If I can go on, sir, there is no evidence to indicate that by restricting airport-related car parking to on-airport, that this has led or will lead to an increase in public transport use. There is no evidence of that. Neither is there any evidence by restricting airport-related car parking to on-airport that this will lead to a reduction in the least sustainable mode, namely kiss and fly. The response to kiss and fly matters is a matter that was brought up in various planning applications which have emerged since the adopted local plan. And if I can just briefly indicate what they have said with respect to applications submitted by GAL, consultations they are to the Council, in respect of the Hilton South Hotel and the application for the erection of a multi-storey car park. The reasons given by the applicant was that there would be a reduction in kiss and fly modes and that these had not been clearly evidenced. Having made that submission in 2 applications which have occurred since 2015 adoption, the case officer proceeded to declare that the contributions to parking capacity on the airport as passenger numbers increase provides the option of parking adjacent to the hotel rather than using kiss and fly or less sustainable locations off airport, and therefore the proposal could help discourage kiss and fly. There's been no evidence at any time in any application submitted since 2015 to justify that. So I went to a hotel last night not so far from here, and when I parked, I asked where I should park, and they said to me, you can park anywhere. I said, well, there's quite a few cars parked around here. And the receptionist, who I've never met, and I've never been to this hotel before, told me, oh, well, they park here because it's too expensive on airport. So whenever you consider sustainability issues, consider, I would say, the average family, maybe with 2 children, maybe with someone who's elderly, maybe someone who's mobility impaired, and ask yourself, are they really going to pay that sort of price when the options available are getting increasingly diverse? And when I mean options available to park your car, it's not a question of off airport, on airport. It's a question of whether you want to use technological network companies such as Uber, or whether you want to use platforms such as Just Park. Just go onto the Just Park site and you'll see how many locations there are around the airport for people to park their cars at very reduced costs. And this is particularly important. Going on, so there's no evidence to show that the use of off-airport car parking facilities has undermined or has prevented any requirements relating to public transport targets, whether those are set out in the Section 106 planning obligation or the 2022 Gatwick ASAS. The evidence is not here to support. What my client's objections really focus on is whether the policy GAT3 is justified, taking into account what we say reasonable alternatives based on proportionate evidence. Policy GAT3 does not provide an effective framework for managing car parking demand, but is a tool which reinforces the prominence of a private operator to control airport-related car parking through the reliance placed on permitted development rights. And this, you will see, is not a submission that I make, it's a submission which GAL make on page 4 of their representations to the questions that you've posed. And they say permitted development rights apply to airport operational land, pursuant to Schedule 2, Part 8, Class F of the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development England Order 2015, and are only available to GAL as the airport operator or its agent of development. These requirements are not available to other persons or organisations, and so cannot benefit third-party operators, and they say such as hotel operators or office users situated on the airport. This policy provides the framework for consideration of this type of proposal. So there is, as you will probably realise, an inherent contradiction in both the approach adopted by GAL and CBC, in that it is stated, and that what is being focused on here is improving access to the airport by public transport mode in accordance with government policy. And I'm not anybody's going to contradict that. But, sir, you have to also bear in mind that there's a need by the airport to maximise revenue derived from passenger car parking income. And if you study the latest reports of the parent company, you will see that car parking income contributes 13% of total income at the airport in 2022. So it's a dual aspect, this. It's a very important revenue stream for the airport. It's very important because the overwhelming majority of land indicated on the proposer's map within the airport boundary is defined as operational land, where the relevant airport operator may construct at any time, subject to the consultation with CBC, surface car parking, decking or multi-storey car parks of any size to any height without the need to gain express planning permission. That is a matter which is well known to GAL, as in 3 of their particular represent their consultation responses to to the authority, they say this, that we are a relevant airport operator, and development plan policies, and you'll see it in 3 of the applications which I've highlighted, which have come forward since 2015, development plan policies are devoid of any weight in circumstances where applications are reliant on permitted development rights, re-endorsing the underlying reason why my clients feel this policy is unsound.
Thank you, Mr. Northern. I've read in your submissions, your statement, I think your concerns, if I can put it, in terms of the effectiveness of the second limb of the policy in terms of the demonstration of need. I think you cite something in terms of 6 of the 7 proposals that have...
There's no demonstrable need evidence, simple as that. It's conflated with locational significance. If you're going to produce a demonstrable need argument, it should be produced in such a way that it defines why that car parking should take place. But so I've got 2 points. If you want me to stop, I'll stop. But I've got 2 points I'd just like to make, if I may.
Brief points, please. Yes.
Thank you. Firstly, sir, things are moving forward rapidly. As you may know, or don't know, sir, from various DCO applications, we've been involved in the Luton Airport DCO application. Climate change is now well beyond matters of on and off airport car parking. It's devoted to what 2 authorities refer to as green controlled growth, which actually means, as I've said in the representations, monitoring certain aspects of the airport through the whole history of the site. Just basically, very briefly, if I may, just to indicate what all this is about. The approach adopted by London Luton Airport, its DC application, and this is where it's all about. It's about combating climate change. And that occurs from various sources. And of course, whether you control GAT3 to off airport or on airport, it doesn't matter. The approach adopted by London Airport in its DCO application, and I should add it's also being promoted by London Heathrow Airport in its forthcoming DCO application, is to set out a binding framework giving additional certainty in forecasting environmental effects in a comprehensive and transparent manner, ensuring exceedances are prevented through the performance of fixed mitigation measures as a means of managing the growth of the airport. What that means in terms of surface access is monitoring the percentage of passengers and staff travelling by unsustainable modes throughout the course of time according to thresholds and limits. The thresholds are imposed to give potential warning of exceedances, environmental effects, and the limits are not to be breached. And these are very severe limits because if they are breached, there is an overall independent organisation who monitors this, which would be made up of the Environmental Steering Group in Luton's case. And mitigation plans are required at every stage of the process. If further breaches occur, the Environmental Steering Group has the ability, or will have the ability, to stop the airport from growing through its slot allocation process. It's that clear. It's extremely serious until the environmental performance of that particular aspect in terms of airport car parking is reduced below a certain level. In other words, where you have EIA saying you shan't go beyond a certain exceedances, what this is imposing is a continuum of thresholds and exceedances which all the time have to be monitored. And that's, in my view, where we're going in terms of combating climate change. Combating climate change is old hat. I think the Learned Council, in respect, said it was the old school, as he referred to it. And we're moving forward. This plan is going to 2040. That's 3 years less than London Luton Airport, 32 million. And we really do need to concentrate on that. But even if, and I know you don't have the power to change the plans, sir, but even if nothing happens on this, what I would ask you to do is just as my second point, alter the revolves. Because my clients would have no objection to saying, well, as part of the first limb of her policy, GAT3, car parking should be, very loosely put, provided on airport. First of all, that should be the first mode of operation. And then a second limb, which effectively reverses the second limb of what is current GAT3, and says, but if a long-term off-airport car parking operator can justify a demonstrable need, it should be allowed off-airport. So the only way a long-term off-airport car parking operator will be able to justify planning permission being granted for his or her scheme would be to show that there is a demonstrable need which is not being met on airport. It's the reverse of that, and I think that's a much more fair point, particularly given the importance placed by CAA in their latest documents on choice, which is becoming more and more important by the Airport Authority. I've gone on too long, so thank you for the interview.
Thank you. Just very briefly, Mr. North, in terms of your wider points around sustainability and climate change, the Council have obviously provided a relatively recent appeal decision in relation to Bristol Airport at document GA 25 in terms of, I think, ultimately saying that off-site parking is, coming back to your point about pricing, priced to perpetuate car travel as a cheaper alternative to on-site parking, public transport potentially over-providing car park at variance or at odds in the case of Bristol to its ASAS and modal shift targets. That's a relatively recent decision. I know you invite me to say, well, you're probably going to invite me to say, well, that's old hat. Things have changed, or things are changing, but obviously I'll afford you the opportunity to respond to that evidence that's been provided by the Borough Council.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, we are aware of that decision at Bristol. Bristol is an airport which is totally surrounded by the green belt. The actual airport uses land which is in the green belt. It's expanded into Silverwing, which is in the green belt area of Bristol Airport. It's totally surrounded by it. And they will say there's been 14 appeals in Bristol, all of which have been dismissed, mostly for small operations and mostly for the reasons you say. But I can also, and I haven't put it in, so show you the reverse of that at Leeds, Bradford, where they say exactly the opposite of that, and I'm quite happy to send that in if you wish me to do so. It's an old appeal relating to a place just outside Leeds, Bradford Airport. Again, it said quite clearly there was no evidence. It's all, as I say, non-evidence based. There's a lot of, dare I say it, assertions based on this, but where is the evidence to prove that a long-term off-airport car parking operator has actually undermined the ASAS? And it doesn't do so, sir, because of the alternatives there are. As I've said, things like Just Park, things like what they call mass mobility as a service. All these are going to change. In time, you'll be able to pick up your phone and say, well, I live in Herefordshire, as I do, and I've got several different alternatives to use, and the pricing will be different. You can pick it up. You may go on a car to here, you may go on a bus. That will change. The whole thing is changing. That, and dare I say it, and people think I'm crazy, autonomous cars. That is all going to change.
Okay, and just so I'm clear from your position, Mr. North, in terms of your proposed second limb to the, what would be through your proposed modification, a second limb to the policy, you refer to a long-term offer. Is there an element of scale to that as well? I think, I'm not sure if you're trying to distinguish between kind of smaller off-site parking operations and whether there should be a more permissive policy for whether there's a scale dimension to it as well as long-term offer.
I can understand that point, sir, because it could lead to proliferation, and I understand that. And it probably should lead to a scale issue, so that someone who is perhaps doing park and ride, because that's where the advantages are. When, just going off piste a bit, you have probably seen APH have an operation at Junction 10A. We were instrumental in getting planning permission for that particular site. We showed the council, Mid Sussex Council, that by moving their site from what was Crawley Down to Junction 10A, that it was enough to fuel an aircraft from London to New York and back. It was colossal. And that's the sort of thing that I think we've got to get to. So in a demonstrable need case, which I've advocated would form part of that second limb, then they would have to show, with evidence such as that, why it is that there are climate change requirements which would not offset the ASAS targets of 48 or 56 or 60%. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. North. I will come back to the Borough Council in terms of anything it wishes to respond to in terms of what I've heard, and I don't know if Gatwick Airport have anything they wish to raise in relation to policy GAT 3. Perhaps if I hear from Gatwick first, and then I'll come to the Borough Council. Is it Ms Sargent for Gatwick on this point, please?
Thank you, sir. I just briefly want to confirm Gal's position. We, as you'll have seen, support the Council's response to these MIQs, and we note that the Council have set out the relevant aspects of the Inspector's report from 2015, particularly paragraph 88, and also the case law and the appeal decisions. Plainly, in our view, if off-airport car parking were allowed, that will prejudice GAL's ability to influence mode share. And I heard Mr North say repeatedly, well, there isn't any evidence that off-airport car parking has prevented public transport uptake or undermined the ASAS. Well, obviously, all of that has been happening in the context of GAT 3 being in place. So I don't really follow the logic of that point. On PD rights, the point GAL is making in its written response is simply that it isn't correct to suggest that there's no need for GAT 3 because GAL can rely on PD rights, the policies needed to govern applications by other parties. That's the point that we were making there. And the only other point I want to address is this reference to green-controlled growth. In GAL's submission, that's not a matter for debate at this examination. Whether green-controlled growth is an appropriate approach is something that would fall to be considered in examining an actual application for a development consent order. Whether that approach is appropriate depends on the specific context of the particular DCO application. So, for example, on things such as whether the application is proposing a cap on passenger movements or whether green-controlled growth might be an appropriate alternative to that, but it's not something says in GAL's submission that you appropriately can turn your mind, certainly not to determine in any real sense at this examination. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And if I can come back to the Borough Council, please, Mr Forstick.
I agree with everything that Ms Sargent has just said. Can I just give a sort of overall framework for your decision, though, on this? The first point is that GAT 3 was rigorously tested the last time round, including by Mr North's clients, and then in the High Court. And all of that process led to the clear conclusion that allowing off-site would be directly contrary to the logic. Second point, what's changed since to undermine that? And our answer is that nothing has changed since. Indeed, the case has got stronger since. And that's what gives rise to the third point. The third point is we're consistently told by Mr North there's no evidence base for any of this. But there is masses of evidence, and it's been tested in multiple inquiries, including by Mr North's clients, as to comparative sustainability, impacts on kiss and fly, just park, anti-competitiveness. All of those have been tested in the inquiries that we've referred you to. And fourthly, what's changed is the Bristol case is another example of what's changed in the sense that there's now a myriad of supporting material to show that the GAT3 approach is justified. And just to correct something that Mr. North said, he focused on Bristol being a green belt case, but this issue wasn't anything to do with green belt, it was to do with sustainability. If I could then move on to PD rights, and obviously PD rights apply as a matter of law, and we can't, as a matter of policy, disapply them. So that's our scope for manoeuvre is limited. However, PD rights only apply if 4 conditions are met. First of all, the land has to be operational land, and as you've heard from us previously, there's quite a lot of Gatwick's land that isn't operational land. Secondly, the development has to be by Gatwick, not by hotels or by purple parking or whatever. And there's land within the airport boundary that's owned by third parties that isn't subject to PD rights. And in fact, you'll have seen in Mr. North's appendices some hotel applications that are not PDable. Thirdly, any PD right only applies if it's non-EIA development. And fourthly, the PD rights only apply if there's not a condition impacting on them. And just to pick up that point, Mr. North refers to the very large MSCP7, multi-storey car park 7, which we're going to hear quite a lot about later on when we come to the car parking need. That was a situation where there was a condition binding the land, and the council said to Gatwick, you can't rely on PD rights because of the condition, and they had a King's Council's advice saying that, and Gatwick accepted that. And so to get MSCP 7 through, Gatwick first of all had to remove that condition under section 73, and then had to apply then had to seek prior approval of the PD right. And on the prior approval of the PD right, it had to show that this very large multi-storey car park 7 was consistent with the section 106 obligation that requires, this is paragraph 5.6.1 of the section 106 obligation, that requires Gatwick to provide sufficient but not more than sufficient. So in other words, whenever the council has looked at PD rights, it has asked itself whether there are sufficient but not more than sufficient spaces being provided. Gatwick knows that, and if there was ever a situation where Gatwick was trying to provide too many, the council would be able to enforce under the 106. But we've never, as far as I'm aware, we've never got to that situation. We've never got to a position where we think Gatwick is trying to provide too many spaces. So that's I hope, a comprehensive answer to the issues on GAT3. Anything else?
Okay, thank you for that. Before I move on to policy GAT4, one of my questions was seeking clarity from Mr. North on potential proposed modifications. I think I'm clear on what you would be seeking on behalf of your client. I think just to correct you, we can as inspectors direct for modifications if we so feel it's necessary, so that remains within our scope. I've got no further questions I wanted to raise on GAT3 now, but before I move on, if you have got any further brief points, Mr. North, you wish to raise at this point. So we've got your written material, and that will carry equal weight to whatever we hear in this room.
Thank you, sir. Yes, you will also have noted in, and I'm not going to repeat it because it's in the written material, what happens with certain hotels who have no car parking, and where that car parking and how it's being provided. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those contributions. I'll now move on, please, if I may, to policy GAT4. I'm just looking around. I don't think anybody from Aurora has turned up to participate. In terms of this policy, I don't believe the council are proposing any modifications to policy GAP 4. And I think, again, if Mr Masson can, I'm going to look to Mr Masson in the first instance to just confirm this is, in essence, a continuation of existing policy, or is it intended to provide perhaps increasing flexibility? And is the policy generally supported by GAL in terms of how what's put forward in the plan?
Thank you. Yeah, it's very much a sort of a roll forward of the existing policy. There's been some slight amendments to it, but essentially what it is, it's a recognition that I think that the airport has various different areas of land or of business floor space that are no longer necessarily needed. I think in part that's a reflection of the way that some of the airline operations have changed over the years. So the policies in place really recognising that Gatwick Airport is designated as a main employment area within the local plan. It is appropriate for that space to be used, provided GAL is able to demonstrate to the council that that space is no longer required for the long-term needs of the airport and its operations as it grows. So frequently what we will see is it normally tends to relate to office space. Oftentimes we will ask GAL to demonstrate why that space is no longer required. I think we're cognizant that with the DCO there may be a need for office space in the future. So frequently it's been temporary permissions. And I should say that basically those permissions relate to the land on the airport, or the employment floor space on the airport being used for a non-airport use. So it would often be a temporary permission enabling the council to review that. I think certainly from the council's perspective, it's been an effective policy. It's enabled floor space that would not otherwise be used to come into a helpful, beneficial use. I think the other point really is that in each occasion we have been able to press the airport to provide that evidence to demonstrate precisely why that floor space is not required for an airport-related use at that time, and we've been able to ask for that, looking further to the long term as well. So I think from our point of view, it has operated effectively.
Thank you. And in terms of its implementation, I mean, is this essentially buildings and property under the ownership or control of GAL, or are there other employment-related or airport-related uses?
Effectively, the policy applies to the whole airport boundary. So there will be operators potentially within that boundary that are not GAL. But again, I think those where that floor space has been used, it was originally an airport-related use. So again, the principle remains that if it was required for an airport-related use, why is it not now? So again, it's that demonstration. I think, and GAL may step in here, but I think a majority of that floor space though is under the ownership of Gatwick Airport. Sorry, just a quick clarification. That the airport-related uses can include land that's owned by third parties within the boundary. Just to clarify.
And before potentially bringing in GAL on this point, I think just thinking back to the submissions from Aurora, then in terms of other, what I would think of as kind of employment buildings at the Gatwick Airport location, I pronounce it Schlumberger House. I think it has another what seems to me a non-phonetic pronunciation. They've also referred to their property at Tinsley House, which is close to, I think, to the Lowfield Heath location. I think understanding why potentially boundaries are changing. So but my assumption was they were previously within the ambit of policy GAP 4, but they'll now find themselves outside of that policy designation. And is the council's approach in respect of the boundary, how those what seem like employment sort of related buildings justified, that they're no longer sort of caught by policy GAP 4? Am I grabbing the wrong end of the wrong stick.
Yeah, I can hopefully help on that. Certainly with Schlumberger, it's not in airport-related use now anyway, so there's no reason why it should remain within the airport boundary. It's obviously a very, as we discussed, a policy-related boundary, and there are other things, including parking, as we've just discussed, that it makes a big difference to. And it obviously will remain an office building which can be used for office purposes, even where it is outside the airport boundary. It doesn't need to be within the airport, and in fact it gives it more flexibility because it will not need to meet the GAP 4 should it change anything that's happening.
But presumably it would be caught by policy GAP 2 on safeguarding in terms of...
If they wanted to significantly extend it, yeah.
Thank you. I will extend an opportunity. Is there anything further that Gal wished to say in terms of the soundness of policy GAP 4 as presented within the submitted plan that you wish to raise, Mr. Norwood?
Thank you, sir. We don't really have very much more to say. Our position as set out in our MIQs, I think covers our thinking on this policy. So apart from the airport boundary point, we're happy with the wording of GAT 4. As Mr. Masson says, there's a lot of office. GAL owns a number of offices on the airport, and they are for airport-related uses. And but if for any reason those offices are vacant and a non-airport related use was to be proposed, then we would go through the process with Crawley to justify it. And as Mr. Masson says, there's where that has occurred, temporary permissions have been granted, which I think has worked well. In relation to Schlumberger House, that is not a GAL-owned office building. I know it's an office permission, and it's currently vacant, sir.
Thank you for that. And is there anything further, Mr. North? I know from your representation, I think you have sort of an in-principle objection to the kind of the approach of GAP 4. I appreciate we picked this up as part of the Part 1 hearings and the kind of the identification of Gatwick as a main employment area. Just obviously cognizant of your representations, but I don't know if there's anything further you wish to add this morning.
I don't think so. So I've said what I said in the earlier representations to you on that. I'll just be repeating what I said earlier.
Thank you for that. I've got nothing further I wish to raise in relation to policy GAP 4. Is there anything further from the Borough Council on policy GAP 4? No. Okay. Thank you for that. So that draws to a conclusion the first part of the agenda. So I'm now going to move on. We will have a mid-morning adjournment. I'm going to aim for around about 11 o'clock for that adjournment. So we're going to press on and we're going to come back to the continuation of the discussion we had undertaken to some extent on the 23rd of November in relation to Gatwick. As indicated in the start of this morning's session, this is really the opportunity to come back to points that have started to be made, but I appreciate certainly from the perspective of GAL in particular, it wanted to reserve its position in terms of the evidence that had been provided within the York aviation paper on behalf of the Borough Council. And it's really coming back to the issues around the robustness of the evidence and justification that land that is identified for surface car parking in the 2019 Airport Master Plan could be developed without detrimental consequence to the ability to comprehensively expand the airport. So as I say, we're going to be looking at the York Aviation paper, which is obviously in its evidence has looked at the material from Mott MacDonald on behalf of Gatwick Green Limited, and the ARAP assessment for GAL in relation to the airport's position. And in essence, at paragraph 3 of the York Aviation paper, it posits the question whether the quantum of area identified for the long stay car parking is necessary as part of a southern runway, wide-spaced runway at Gatwick. So in terms of the how I'd like to kind of deal with this this session this morning is really in sort of two parts in terms of what's presented in the York Aviation paper. The first area is broad, and it probably has some overlap to the discussion on the 23rd of November, and it's around the, sort of the principle of flexibility and the extent to which you can kind of deviate from the 2019 airport master plan. And then the second area is really the kind of the issue around the amount of land, quantum of land that could be required for car parking going forward, in terms of how that's been calculated by the respective parties, and more generally where we're going in terms of mode share and potential future kind of car parking provision in terms of format and what implications that could have. And we'll look at some of the particular detail points that are raised within the York Aviation paper and the responses to it. So in terms of where we start from, if I could start first in terms of just the York Aviation paper, and as I indicated, this kind of general point, various points that are raised within the paper around the principle of kind of flexibility, and I think it comes back to kind of various strands. Firstly, is the York Aviation paper justified in asserting that the master planning process that's been undertaken for Gatwick is high level, is not necessarily supported by detailed evidence when it comes to matters such as car parking provision? To some extent, the Northern Runway project kind of demonstrates flexibility from the 2019 master plan. And then finally, the York Aviation statement that in their submission, no other airports in the UK, to their knowledge, have safeguarded land for car parking, and that's at paragraph 24 of their paper. So as the Council submitted the York Aviation paper, I'll give you kind of first dibs on the kind of the principle of flexibility. I appreciate, Mr. Forsyth, there'll probably be an element of overlap of what we discussed on the 23rd, but I think I'm very much kind of wrapping this into the York Aviation paper.
Yes, safeguarding has to be justified by robust evidence. You'll hear that sentence a number of times today, I suspect. This is the first time that Crawley has considered fully the justification for the extent of the safeguarding. Previously, it's let it go and has just gone along with the lines drawn by Gatwick. This is the first time that it's tested those lines in detail. The master plan obviously is not binding. It's Gatwick's wish. But as we discussed last time, it's for the local planning authority and you to decide whether to grant that wish. And there's a basic misconception underpinning lots of GAL's submissions that effectively what they say goes is completely misconceived. Put absolutely bluntly, the Airport Commission had the same plans that you had. They had a very, very high-level plan showing a huge area of land covered with surface-level car parking, all the land to the east. There was no attempt in detail to justify either the numbers or the efficiency of it, and Gatwick's submissions in response to York that for the purposes of today are just simply wrong. That there wasn't any testing of whether that showed the need for 138 hectares to be safeguarded for car parking. It's simply misconceived assertion.
Sorry, Mr. Fawcett, when you say test, you're saying through the Airport Commission process?
There just wasn't any. I mean, and Gatwick saying that we just scratched our head when we read that, because it's just simply wrong, and Gatwick know it's wrong. All that happened was that the Airport Commission said that there was a feasible scheme for a second runway at Gatwick. It got into none of the detail about either the quantum of land or the efficiency of the proposal shown on the master plan. So the idea that somehow this is all fixed, it's all been agreed already, is simply wrong on the facts. This is and therefore this is effectively the first time, and we say it is a requirement for you now to test the robustness of the evidence. We're raising it, and we need to see robust evidence to justify the extent of the safeguarding. You have our notes, and I think Gatwick Green have put in notes on how significant an intrusion on private rights safeguarding is, and therefore how robustly it has to be justified. We now know, given the concession in Gatwick's letter, the very belated concession in Gatwick's letter, I should add, of the 14th of December, we now know that that there was engagement by the council in trying to understand the justification for the 138 hectares, and there was no response. We then got the Arup paper, which I'll obviously come to the Arup paper misconceptions in due course, but the Arup paper was the asserted basis of the justification for the 138 hectares, and the York paper shows why it's simply materially wrong in multiple respects, such to not provide any reliable evidence, never mind robust evidence. And so this isn't really a question of flexibility about 138 hectares and whether the 138 hectares is about right. We should be starting from exactly the other end of the spectrum, namely, has Gatwick justified the safeguarding to the extent claimed or to any extent here? And on its evidence, we come nowhere near justifying anything like 138 hectares or even 94 hectares. Nowhere near. And I think you'll hear from Gatwick Green on various permutations that bring it down very dramatically from even the 94 hectares that we're proposing to safeguard. I think that's our big picture answer to your flexibility question.
Thank you. And can I, before I bring in others from the Borough Council's perspective, I mean, GAL, in their response as part of to the York aviation paper, say that the Airports Commission's assessment of GAL's proposals was found to be a credible kind of option for airport expansion. Does that, in the Council's view, where does that take us in terms of the robust evidence needed?
It tells you that the master plan showing the second runway to the south and the terminals and the road infrastructure and an element of car parking is a credible option. It doesn't tell you anything. I mean, that's my point. It doesn't tell you anything about whether the car parking land needs to be 138 hectares or whether it's an efficient use of land, partly because the Airport Commission didn't have anything to go on in that regard. I think they were working on the 2014 master plan. The 2014 and the 2019 master plan simply have a wrong figure for car parking spaces, a very seriously wrong figure for car parking spaces, and then a huge area of land shown on a plan to allocate it. That's all it does.
Thank you. In terms of the kind of sequence and order I'd probably like to take things is, I appreciate Gatwick Green are here in large part kind of with the Borough Council, probably on this matter at least in terms of plan soundness. I don't know if anybody from Gatwick Green wishes to kind of come in on this kind of general sort of overarching point within the York Aviation paper in terms of the principle of kind of flexibility from what's in the 2019 airport master plan. And then I'll bring in Gatwick Airport, and then I'll give the Borough Council, as it's their plan, the opportunity to respond to anything raised further by Gal. So is there anything further from Gatwick Green on this first part of this discussion?
Sir, thank you, if I might. I think it's fair to say we've all got something to say. That's to say myself, Mr. Mayor and Mr. Cross. We haven't divided up our points along the lines of flexibility and so on. So if later on points pop up, which perhaps would have been better said now, forgive us for that, but we'll do the best we can. Can I first of all adopt and agree with what Mr. Forsdick has said? We'll get on to the numbers, I think, later. So just dealing with the flexibility point. Can I come back to the Airport Commission point relied upon by Gal? Of course, the Airport Commission was considering a master plan before the Northern Runway proposals were conceived. So what the Airport Commission might have to say about a master plan with a Northern Runway, we simply don't know. So in that sense, the Airport Commission's, whatever they said, is now overtaken by events. But it is, I would say, entirely misleading, and I use that word having thought about it, entirely misleading for Gal to say, it's paragraph 2.2 of their representations, that, and I quote, the safeguarded area was recognised by the Airport Commission as being a credible option. That's what they say to you, the safeguarded area, not the scheme, not the proposal, not the idea, but the safeguarded area. And as Mr. Forsdick says, the Commission had no remit and made no finding about safeguarding. I'll just give you some references. You don't need to look them up now. The area was already safeguarded at the time. That's paragraph 10.6 of the report. The terms of reference are at pages 37 to 38 of the Commission report. They don't include looking into safeguarding, and specifically the quote at page 9 from the executive summary, which is what Gal put before you, is looking at the scheme and the proposal together with others, Heathrow and so on. It's not looking at safeguarding, and so it is misleading, or at best from Gal's position, sloppy, for them to have said to you that the Airport Commission's said anything about safeguarding. It hasn't. So I think that's all I want to say on this part. I've got other points to say about the numbers, but we'll come back to that. And perhaps if I can hand over to Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Yeah, similarly to James, I think most of my information to share will relate to the detailed point around the numbers and the areas, and we'll come back to that later. There is perhaps just one point that I think is relevant to the general principle here, and I'd like to mention the way in which we normally carry out master plans for airports. There's a lot of analytical work that goes on as a part of the master planning process, looking at options, solutions, calculated area requirements and all sorts of things. And the majority of that information ends up becoming supporting or background information. It may be included in appendices to a master plan report. And very often it might be the case that an airport would keep a lot of that information to themselves, sitting on a shelf, reference material that they can use as they develop the airport. Obviously, most airports choose not to publish all of that information into the public domain because it's not, strictly speaking, necessary. What airports often will do is produce a version of a master plan report that is published into the public domain. And that's particularly if they want to engage with community stakeholders, get endorsement towards their development plans. So you could think of there being two airport master plans, a very detailed one that remains with Gatwick, and a much more of a publicity document in some ways, a glossy brochure that might be published into the public domain. And so the reason I mention this is that we would assume that Arab would work in a similar fashion in carrying out master plans for Gatwick Airport, and that there would be more detailed evidence behind the scenes, more detailed calculations. And I think that's relevant here to the general principle, because we've had 3 years really since the local plan process started in 2021 to see all of that evidence, and we haven't seen all of that evidence yet. We've seen some evidence presented in the latest paper, but there's some evidence still missing, and that's a specific plan that shows how parking could be provided within the 138 hectares. You know, where are particular types of car parks, how will they be accessed, you know, which of them are decked, which of them are robotic parking. We haven't seen that plan. We've got a plan that shows a very large grey land use area that's needed, but no specific details around how that area would be used. So I think it's important just to note that there's evidence that hasn't been presented.
So could I just come in on the back of that to make a point about orientation, and it goes back to something Mr. Forsdick said. It is for GAL to justify the safeguarding. It's not for the other parties to show how their proposals can fit in with Gatwick's master plan. GAL are asking for the safeguarding. GAL must justify the safeguarding. And I would just invite you to step back and think, what must GAL have done over the last few years, knowing that the Gatwick Green proposal was coming, either as an objection to a plan or as an allocation in the plan? They must surely have looked at how master planning could work with Gatwick Green in place. They must surely have done that. If they didn't do that, it must surely be because they know it can all work. But if they have done it, which they must surely have, why haven't they produced it? You don't have a single plan or alternative master planning iteration or alternative options before you. Nothing. And they've either not done it, which must be because they know it works, or they have done it and they're not producing it, which also must be because the options show that Gatwick Green and the airport can sit alongside each other. If they're sitting on evidence, master planning options that show it can't work, they would have produced it. Of course they would have done. And it's now too late, of course, to do so. But they've had the chance. You've given them the chance. But it is important. It's for them to justify their safeguarding, not the other way around.
Thank you. I'm mindful to kind of have the split in discussion, and we'll come on to the detail later. Just so I can help direct Gatwick Green's contributions at this stage, and I'll invite Gal to respond to some of the points that have been raised. In terms of the specific point raised in the York Aviation paper, I've mentioned it earlier, it's their paragraph 24. They assert there are no examples of airports safeguarding of airport land for car parking. I don't know if Gatwick Green have looked into that or would support that submission.
I don't think we can comment on that. We haven't checked all of the other airports in the UK to see if any of them have got safeguarded land for car parking. To the extent of York's research on that, I'm not aware.
Thank you. Mr. Cross, did you want to come in on this point?
Yes, thank you. And my point is directed at the flexibility issue and the arguments presented in section 5 of GAL's response to the York Aviation paper, particularly paragraphs 5.1 to 5.5. There's concerns raised about the additional distance required to access the remaining car parks. So we've looked at that very carefully. The increase in distance due to Gatwick Green's presence is something around 100 metres, which in our view is not a serious impediment to the delivery of the car parks to the south and the east of Gatwick Green once the two are both constructed. The areas south of Antlands Road and east of the realigned Balcombe Road are completely unaffected by what we do at Gatwick Green. The eastern and southernmost car parking areas haven't moved, sir. They're exactly as they always were. and accessing them will be no more difficult, in large part, with Gatwick Green than it would have been without it. There is no technical justification that we've seen provided by GAL as to why the road alignments in the master plan could not be slightly amended, and very slightly amended, to work in unison with the Gatwick Green site. Indeed, should Gatwick Airport come to work with us in future, I'm sure we could find ways in which jointly travel to their car parks and from their car parks in whatever mode that is undertaken could be accommodated very easily within the plans that we have for Gatwick Green. In particular, I would mention that our sustainable transport corridor, which runs north-south through Gatwick Green, would form an excellent means of accessing the terminals in future by sustainable transport, by buses, fastway, electric or otherwise. And if we were to work together, that would reduce the time it takes to get to those terminals rather than increase it, on a road provided entirely by Gatwick Green. Existing parking sites on Charlwood Road and the Perimeter Road south are 8 to 10 minutes drive to the terminals. That would be probably slightly more than it would take to drive from the eastern parts of Gatwick Green to the terminals. So we don't understand that point, sir. We have no evidence to support it, and we refute it. Finally, and this is just again about flexibility, there is a perfectly successful commercial park and ride facility provided by APH east of the M23, which operates successfully at a greater distance than would be the case to access the easternmost parts and the southernmost parts of the current safeguarded land with Gatwick Green in place. So on the flexibility point, sir, that you stressed at the beginning of this matter, we would say there is plenty of flexibility. It only needs Gatwick Airport to work with us to ensure that flexibility can be maintained.
Thank you for that. So I'll now turn to Gatwick, please, in terms of this kind of first sort of overarching issue. The submission, as I read it within the York Aviation paper, I think I highlighted at the start, as I've sort of summarised, that the approach in the plan is justified in terms of the master planning process is high level. It's not necessarily supported in York Aviation's view by detailed evidence when it comes to matters such as car parking provision. And I've obviously heard now from both the Borough Council and Gatwick Green in terms of the their views in terms of the weight that should be given to the GAL submissions in terms of how the proposals were looked at or tested through the airport's commission's process. So if I can invite GAL to respond to those points in a similar way, please.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to begin, but I will then turn to Mr. Norwood to explain the level of detail that did go into the master planning work. But I want to respond firstly to Mr. Forsdick's observation that this is the first time he says that the council has tested the safeguarding land and the extent of that. Why the council has previously felt that it didn't need to trouble itself on that point, I have no idea. But it is certainly not the first time that the extent of safeguarding has been tested. And I direct your attention again, sir, to paragraph 80 of the 2015 Inspector's Report, where, as you'll have seen and you'll recall from November, Gatwick Green last time around were trying for the same outcome as they're trying for this time. And the inspector said, and he began by referring to the core strategy inspector, so this wasn't even him departing, this was him continuing the approach of the previous inspector. He said it's difficult to identify on a contingent basis the precise area of land required for such a complex major project, and it's not unreasonable to include some flexibility, even if not all the land is ultimately used. I consider that the evidence on safeguarding is robust and it satisfies the tests in the NPPF. Well, you've heard already this morning from the council in relation to GAT 3 and GAT 4, they say there's no material change and, you know, they're rolling forward the approach previously. GAL are waiting to have identified the material change that the council contends justifies a difference in approach to safeguarding here, because in our submission you haven't been provided with that material justification for a change of approach now from the approach that has been taken to safeguarding previously. So that's what I want to say on that. And just in terms of the point made by Mr Forsdick about engagement, you'll have seen the letter from Mr Norwood. We apologise for the oversight in terms of the correspondence, but it remains our view that the engagement by the council was limited in extent and it came late in the day. I'm not sure why it was said that there wasn't any response, because as you'll have seen in Mr Norwood's letter, there was, this is Mr Norwood's letter of the 14th of December, essentially matters culminated in a meeting on the 4th of March, and it was agreed that there was such a difference of view that the statement of common ground wasn't going to be pursued thereafter. But it isn't the case that GAL simply did nothing in relation to the council having made contact. So that's what I wanted to say, and I'll turn now to Mr Norwood just to respond on the point about the detail of work that went into the master planning process. So you will, just so my team know what I'm hoping to happen from the back benches. We have Mr Ellis and Mr Higgins sitting in front, and they will be responding on the quantum and the numbers aspect, but my understanding is that you want to come to that later on. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yes, so in terms of the work that was undertaken for the Airport Commission, it's been said that the land was already safeguarded. It was safeguarded as a result of the 2003 Airports White Paper. So there was land was safeguarded, and that safeguarding was in place. And that was the scheme that was prepared at that stage by the then BAA, who were the owners and operators of Gatwick Airport. In 2010, sir, the airport changed ownership. And in 2013, the government decided to hold what we would call the Airports Commission process. And the airport at that stage, Gatwick, was invited to participate in that Airport Commission process. And at that stage, we looked again at the BAA master plan, and we carried out a significant, and it really was a significant amount of work to review the airport master plan at that stage and the land that would be required for the additional southern runway. And what you can see, sir, in the airport, in Gatwick's master plan is, and I can give you the reference for that master plan, it is EGSM/GA/06. So, and it's Plan 21, sir. And if you look at Plan 21, you will see that as a result of that detailed work in 2013, 2014, there were changes that were made to the boundary of the airport. So you can see that there is the blue line, which was the line that was developed in 2013, but you can see there was a hatched line as well. And if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, so that's the south east corner, you can see that land was actually taken away from that safeguarded area because of the detailed work that was carried out at that time in 2013. And you can also see around the edge of the boundary. Because in 2013, 2014, we undertook a significant amount of work to really develop our proposals. And I think I made the analogy before Christmas about the jigsaw. And I did smile to myself when I was doing a jigsaw over Christmas. But an airport master plan is built up of all of these pieces, and all of the pieces are important. And when we looked at the airport master plan, you would be going from a two-terminal operation as it is today, with car parking dispersed around the site, to, in the future, a three-terminal operation with the car parking consolidated in that area of land to the east of the airport. And the reason for that consolidation of all of that car parking is because that is the optimum location for the car parking. The majority of our travellers, the passengers that arrive at the airport, come off the strategic motorway network. So they're either coming north or south along the M23. They come off on the M23 spur. And as you can see on Plan 20, sir, the best location to accommodate all of that vehicle traffic is literally off the motorway network. And then you can then get your travel into one of the three terminals that would be either serving the north terminal, the south terminal, or the new terminal associated with that southern runway. So the broad concept and the thinking behind the master plan was all done. We didn't detail master plan every single car parking sort of zone and the internal arrangements, but all of it had to work because of the nature in which the road system, and there was a significant amount of work done to develop that road system with the national highways at the time because of the interaction with the motorway network. So you can see the roundabouts and the road system coming off that motorway junction, and you would turn left to go into the car park, or you would turn right to go to the terminal. So all of that work was undertaken at the time, sir, to make sure that the master plan and the broad principles of the master plan held together as a coherent, well thought through piece of work. What you do if you overlay Gatwick Green onto that area of site is that you then introduce a very fragmented and very dispersed arrangement. And that is not a very efficient layout. And when you have the opportunity to have an efficient, well thought through, comprehensive redevelopment, then that is the proposal that we put forward in the master plan document. And I think it was scrutinised by the Airport Commission process. That was a 2-year thorough examination to make sure that all of the component parts of the master plan worked together in order to provide a credible proposal that the Airport Commission could assess in order to meet the needs of its remit. So I think, sir, there was a huge amount of work that was done into developing this master plan, and it was done very carefully in a very systematic and logical manner.
And can I ask Mr. Norwood, in response to the points raised by Mr. Pereira on behalf of Gatwick Green, this kind of submission that Gatwick may have done more further detailed technical work once the council had published its proposals within the the borough plan for Gatwick Green to kind of test what the impacts could be, or his further assertion that the absence of evidence may indicate you haven't done the work, but this kind of submission that under both scenarios an assumption could be drawn that Gatwick Airport is comfortable with the Gatwick Green proposal. There's either something not in front of us that would demonstrate that, and it exists and it's not been provided, or the absence of it is a demonstration that Gatwick Airport is as I say, comfortable with the Gatwick Green proposal. I don't know if you have any points you wish to say in rebuttal to those submissions.
Richard, did you want to take that point? Or? I'll let my colleague Richard Higgins take that point. Just very briefly, sir, all I would say is that the first time we saw the York Aviation note was actually in November of this year. And until that point, we hadn't seen any of the proposals or that sort of detailed analysis that had been put forward by the by Crawley Borough Council. So, and I think that York Aviation note came out, I think, a day before the responses to the first round of MIQ. So it was very late in the day that we saw that information. So, but I think my colleague Richard, who was working on the detailed proposals at the time, will provide a better answer.
Mr. Higgins.
Yes, thank you, sir. Richard Higgins for Gatwick Airport. There are a number of points that relate to the quantum of parking, which, as instructed, we'll leave to the second half of the discussion. But just to pick up on a couple of points in terms of the flexibility, and Mr. Norwood identifies a number of aspects of the continuity of a parking proposal that provides a consolidated, operationally efficient and logical master plan component alongside all the other parts of the airport. It is true that there is significant amount of work that's gone in, not just to the allocation of areas within the master plan and the areas for parking, but also the requirements for access. I would draw your attention to a couple of other points not directly related to the Gatwick Green question, but just to illustrate the way in which the master plan takes account of that work, and indeed that the safeguarding area takes account of that work. One is along the southern boundary of the safeguarding area, where there has been a change to the safeguarding extent along the route through Manor Royal, and that's as a direct result of doing some concept design work on the highway alignment, which has had to demonstrate that there was a feasible alignment through that area, and also in order to seek to avoid existing premises where it was possible to do so. So the fact that the safeguarding boundary on the southern side of the airport has changed is an example of where we have done some additional significant work and sought to refine the safeguarding area as a result. The second area is in the very sort of furthest southeast corner of the safeguarding area, where we actually concluded there was no justification for including a series of properties and an area of land that is now outside of our proposed safeguarding. Again, because we, in our approach, we could conclude that the safeguarding area that we have described would accommodate all the requirements for the master plan. One thing that I would just like to highlight, which is in both the Airports Commission work and the 2019 master plan, which is in looking at the impact of the overall development, particularly the overall size of the airport, and Mr. Norwood points out this is a larger airport with 3 terminals and additional facilities, that there is an impact on existing premises and land to the south of the existing airport. And it would be certainly appropriate at the master planning stage to allow for the relocation of some of that commercial property that would be dislocated. And indeed, within the documentation that's been supplied, we identify approximately 35 hectares, which is within the safeguarding area, that is provided to allow for that relocation of existing premises. And at the point at which we were preparing the master plan, that degree of flexibility in the more holistic approach to providing a sort of a full development plan for the airport and all its relevant uses was appropriate and illustrated the level of flexibility within the work that had been done. I won't go into any further aspects of how the parking areas are connected, or indeed the numbers until later, other than to just make a specific point to the comment that Mr. Cross made in respect of the, I think it's the sort of sustainable access route through the Gatwick Green site, which is in a north to south orientation. Please bear in mind that in terms of the overall parking operation for the sites, were we to look for areas around the Gatwick Green allocation, then we would need to provide access not just for car park buses to provide access back to terminals, which would actually be in an east-west orientation rather than a north-south orientation, because the terminals are west of the railway. But also that access would be required for private vehicles, for people to actually access the car parks themselves. So there is a little bit of a disconnect there between providing a sustainable access route and allowing access for customers of the airport-related parking. The other thing that I would just like to pick up on very briefly, if I may, which actually touches on some of the discussions about GAT3 earlier on. One of the particular tenets around GAT3 and the provision of on-airport parking being the most sustainable location, and Mr. Norwood has touched on this point, is that we are very closely connected to the strategic road network, and in essence a vast majority of our customers who park on the airport will access directly from the strategic road network onto airport-related roads. There is relatively little movement along local networks and local roads, and obviously it is very much in Gatwick's interest, and indeed in the local authorities and the local highway authorities' interest, to minimise the amount of traffic that is on local roads, combining with some of the background traffic in the area. That is actually available and designed into the approach for the safeguarding area. So actually connecting the parking area with the terminals would be on airport-related roads. The difficulty with considering a solution with the Gatwick Green development in place is that it would force traffic actually onto using part of the aligned A23 and take away the opportunity to access all of the parking areas directly across the roundabout, which is the northern of the two roundabouts on the proposed highway solution, which is shown in the plans. I'll reserve any other comments for later on the numbers, if that's okay.
Thank you for that. Can Gatwick Airport please kind of jog my memory in terms of the anticipated sort of time frame for implementation of a second wide space runway, were that to kind of successfully proceed, when sort of construction would start and ultimate kind of final kind of full operation?
So I'll turn to Mr. Norwood for the dates, but I was going to come back to this later on, actually, in response to something Gatwick Green say in their response to the York Aviation note. So this is a response to their paragraph 1.28 and onwards, where they say timing of a southern runway development. Gatwick don't agree that, I mean, I'm not sure, and I'm sure if I've misunderstood this, Gatwick Green will correct my understanding in due course, but I think it's being said that in order for the second runway, the southern runway, to come forward, there would need to be a further round of airports commission work and some sort of alteration to the airport's NPS. So we do not agree with that. The airport's NPS in legal terms does not have effect in relation to Gatwick. That document states expressly at paragraph 1.40 that it has effect essentially only in relation to the delivery of additional airport capacity through the provision of a northwest runway at Heathrow. So in legal terms, the airport's NPS does not have effect in relation to the delivery of a southern runway at Gatwick, and that means that a southern runway at Gatwick would not fall under section 104 of the Planning Act. It would come forward under section 105. So the position, in short, in relation to a second runway at Gatwick is that an application for a DCO would go in, and obviously it would be for Gatwick to make the case in terms of the need for that, and the position in relation to what is or isn't happening at Heathrow. But we don't accept that there would need to be necessarily an airports commission process or an amendment to the airport's NPS. Having said that, I'll ask Mr. Norwood to give you GAL's position on the time scales.
Thank you. Yes, so our master plan document at section 5.4 relates to the safeguarding for an additional runway to the south. I think it's our view was that when we were preparing that document, what we said was that we were not actively pursuing the second runway or the additional runway to the south at that time. And as you are aware, we are pursuing the Northern Runway project. But in general terms, we believe it would take about 5 years to go through the planning process. And then it would probably take about 5 years for the first phase of construction following a successful approval of any planning permission. So from the decision to prepare a development consent order to when it would first be operational would take about 10 years, sir. The scheme would be phased. So depending on the phasing and depending on the traffic forecasts and the need at that time, to be built out to its full extent, what we said at the time, it would take between 20 to 25 years to be built out to its full extent. I think that would need to be reviewed, sir, on the basis of the forecasts at the time. But certainly our position has always been that it would take, from the decision to prepare the application to when it would first become operational, would take about 10 years.
Thank you for that. Mr. Keane for Ardmore, please.
So thank you. I wasn't expecting to speak on this item on the agenda, sir, but I'd just like to respond to a point made by Mr. Higgins. But very briefly, before I do that, can I endorse the submissions, representations you've already heard from Mr. Pereira and Mr. Forsdick earlier, and this is entirely consistent with what you've heard from me in previous matters 2 in particularly, that it's for GAL to justify the safeguarding sought, and that it's a requirement for you to test the robustness of the evidence to justify the extent of safeguarding, and you'll know the position of Ardmore, sir, in relation to whether or not the safeguarding in principle and extent has been justified. But just to deal with a point raised by Mr. Higgins, in relation to your question, sir, about, and it, again, point first made by Mr. Pereira about what might have been optioned beyond the 2019 master planning, we were told that GAL has done a significant amount of work in relation to parking and access, and that the master planning takes account of that work. And one example that was given was not in relation to parking, but in relation to changes to the southern boundary to the extent of safeguarding, with particular focus on the route through Manor Royal. Now, that's a matter that we'll perhaps indeed it's on your agenda next, sir, but that's, as far as I'm aware, that's not option information or evidence that's before us. And so it goes to Ms. Pereira's point that there appears to have been scoping out of alternatives or differences. I don't know, sir. But we're told that there's been scrutiny of the southern boundary, particular focus on the route through Manor Royal. As far as we're aware, that's not evidence that we've seen. No doubt be told if I'm wrong.
Thank you. Before we do break for a mid-morning adjournment, I'll give Mr. Higgins the opportunity to come back on that point.
Yes, thank you, sir. The point I was making is that there is evidence, and it's in the Airports Commission documentation that has been supplied as part of both the Airports Commission and the master plan, showing the alignment of the proposed diversion of the A23, which cuts around the eastern side of the airport, cuts through the northern side of Manor Royal, and rejoins the existing A23 alignment at County Oak, which is a concept design, but suitably engineered at a concept level highway alignment, which is then reflected in the changes to the safeguarding area, rather than a straight line that was previously adopted within the earlier safeguarding. So it's an illustration, not perhaps of the optioneering that has been described, but an illustration of the detailed design work and consideration of different elements of the master plan that went into the changes to the safeguarding area.
Thank you. I've made a note of that. We'll come back to this further on my agenda. So before we take a mid-morning adjournment, I will give an opportunity for brief responses to what I've heard. So I think it's Mr. Pereira first, and then I don't know, Mr. Forsdick wishes to follow on from that. So Mr. Pereira, please.
Thank you. I think I've got 4 points, very short. First, Mr. Norwood said the area was safeguarded because it was safeguarded in the white paper. The white paper expressly says it is not safeguarding the land. You can see the reference at paragraph 2.7 of our Matter 5 hearing statement. But if that is the basis of the area, then obviously from the outset it's misconceived. The white paper says expressly this should not be taken as a safeguarding map. That's point one. Secondly, it's inherent in the justification for a large area that Gatwick needs to show that a smaller area won't work. That's obvious, and nothing has been said by Gatwick about that. They talk about the efficiencies of a large area, but nothing about why a smaller area won't work. Thirdly, I think actually I've only got 3 points now. Thirdly, you asked a question about the submission I had made, and you heard the answer, as all of us did in the room, and it's been recorded. I simply invite you to go back to the recording in your own time and just ask yourself, have you had a straight answer to that very straight question? Thank you.
Mr. Forsdick, anything further?
I adopt those points. I just want to come back on, I think, 3 big points. First of all, it's said there's been no material change in circumstances. There's been fundamental changes in circumstances. The Airport Commission has reported, the NPS has been made, and the Supreme Court has given its judgment. That led to the Council reviewing safeguarding in its entirety, as you remember, with the Area Action Plan. When it was told that was not appropriate by the original advisory inspector, it then went through the exercise of looking at the master plan justification for each part in some detail, and it raised with Gatwick in pre-submission correspondence the justification for the car parking, and it got no answer. And therefore, that is the material change in circumstances there. On engagement, it said there was engagement, but that misses the point. There was a phone call and a meeting, but there was no evidence on need, and there still is no evidence on need for this amount of space. Thirdly, it is said there is significant work for the master plan, so significant work underpinning the master plan. Yes, no doubt there was for the master plan as a whole for the second runway and the terminal. But where is there any work or any evidence of any work justifying 138 hectares for car parking? And they've had ample opportunity to provide that evidence before you. They've even had this special session just to allow them to respond to York. And still, there is no plan showing that you need anything like 138 hectares of to provide 69,000 car parking spaces. On timing, sir, there's just one further matter on timing that I need to raise. Timing isn't really particularly our issue, but just on the evidence that was given just now on the timing of the delivery of the southern runway, you've got your note, and you'll see the 10 years plus the 20 to 25 years. That's if you started now, but of course there's no indication of any intent to start now, and you do need to add to your note of that Gatwick is telling the DCO inquiry that the Northern Runway project wouldn't be at capacity until 2038. So any future need for the second runway would be starting sometime after 2038. So we're talking about the Never Never Land for all of this anyway. I'll come to the other points under the figures under part 2 of your agenda.
Thank you. I mean, Gatwick may want to respond to some of that in due course. What I'm going to say now is we've come to 11:15. What I'm going to suggest is we take a mid-morning adjournment now for 15 minutes, so we'll resume at 11:30. I will move on to the second area of questioning. I've budgeted around an hour. At the moment, that feels quite optimistic, but we've got other things to cover, or I want to cover this morning, that are not car park related. So I would invite people over the adjournment to just think about how you condense or summarise the submissions that you wish to make to me, and I'll take them in a similar order. I hear from the council first, then from Gatwick Green, and then principally from Gatwick Airport in terms of their response to the York aviation paper. But I do want to complete, as far as is practicable, this morning's business, or otherwise we're going to end up with another rollover potentially for other Gatwick related policies. So if people can be back here please for 11:30, and we'll resume promptly. Thank you. Okay, everybody, it's now 11:30, so I'm going to resume as I'm mindful of the time that we still have available this morning and what we need to get through. I'm going to move on to what I described as my sort of second area of kind of questioning, which really brings together or focusing in part in items 2 and 3 of my agenda, item 3A. And what I really want to start from the perspective of is we're looking ultimately, I think, is it a 95 million passengers per annum airport with the second wide-spaced runway. Mr. Forsdick referred to a figure of 69,000 kind of parking spaces prior to the mid-morning adjournment. Going through the various kind of evidence-based documents, I mean, I had in mind a sort of a ballpark figure in a range of 68 to 70,000 kind of parking spaces or thereabouts. And I think what I want to hear from people, particularly in relation to points that have been raised in the York aviation paper and how that's looked at the other evidence, is whether the continued safeguarding of all land to the east of Balcombe Road, if that was to sort of go forward as effectively a proposed modification to the submitted plan, would arise because of York Aviation's submission, and I think also supported by Gatwick Green and LRM planning for WT Lamb, it would be an overestimation of the amount of land required on 3 sort of broad areas. A, it would include an element of double counting in terms of off-site provision. Secondly, it would not reflect the general direction of travel in relation to modal shift. And thirdly, ongoing kind of changes within the format of parking would lead to kind of land take efficiencies, and therefore ultimately you do not need the full extent of the 138 hectares provided. I'm going to start by inviting the Borough Council in the first instance, if there's anything further it wishes to say in support of the the York Aviation paper. I'll then invite contributions from Gatwick Green, and then for Mr. Rees, if there's anything you wish to add on behalf of your clients, and then give a full and fair opportunity for Gatwick Airport Limited to pick up its points that it has in terms of the concerns of the York Aviation paper. So is it Mr. Forsdick first, please?
I'm only going to make big points. I'm going to make 10 big points, and I've been forewarned as the points Gatwick Green are going to make, and I'm going to not go over those points to avoid to try to stick within your time frame. First point, and this is a fundamental legal point, it's for Gatwick to provide robust evidence of the extent of the need for safeguarding. Assertion is not evidence, and our short point is, where's the plan or where's the exposition as to what you need for 70,000 spaces efficiently organised? That's the first point. Second, we now know that Arup's need figure for on-airport is seriously overstated and simply wrong. And yet that is the basis, page 2 of their report, for their justification of the 138 hectares. They explicitly say that this is suitably efficient for 138 hectares for 94,000 spaces. So the figure's simply wrong, so the whole edifice of Arup is simply wrong. That is a major mistake that somehow Gatwick allowed to be put before this inquiry. But even now, Gatwick has failed to follow through on the consequence of that major mistake in terms of the land required. Third, there is a stark and self-serving inconsistency between what actually happens now on the ground in the real world here with block parking and what Gatwick says is appropriate. They now claim that 33%, this paragraph 3.5.2 of their note, that 33% is operationally required. That's as far as it can go in terms of customer preferences and so on. But in fact, on the ground now, they are delivering at least 45% of long stay car parking as a block parking product. I just need to go off on a little detour just for a second on this because we say it's much more than 45%. Can you go to table 3 of their note, please? If you see at 3.5.2, they talk about around a third of the long stay total as block parking in the third line of 3.5.2. Yep. And then if you look at table 3 over the page, you see that in reality on the ground now, 45% is block parked. But it's worse than that because the self-parking includes the short stay. So when we're looking at long stay, you need to take off the short stay, which is 4,456 short stay multi-storey car parking spaces. And so you get to about 16,200-ish. And therefore block parking is way over 50% of the long stay offer. So how Gatwick can say 33% is entirely lost on us. Fourth, there is a stark and self-serving inconsistency between what GAL is actually doing on the ground and what it is telling the DCO inquiry and what it is telling you. In the DCO inquiry, it is explaining in detail how it can efficiently deliver car parking. For example, in the DCO transport assessment at 17.2.19, it explains the advantages of robotics by cutting space by up to 50%, and about the rollout of 2,500 robotics-based car parking spaces. That's in its MIQ 5.11. But then it doesn't count that or assess that in its response to York. Also, it allows you to proceed on the basis of just fundamentally flawed figures as to the short stay car parking that's being provided in a 2-runway world. There are already 4,456. That's including MSCP4. MSCP7 will add another 3,200, and there's also the Hilton multi-storey car park. So there's already 8,625 at least on the airport multi-storey once you've got MSCP7. And yet Gatwick would have you believe that with the Terminal 3 and its multi-storeys added in, you're only going to get to 8,500. So another self-serving stark inconsistency. Fifth, this goes back to the Airport Commission. GAL wrongly claims that this has all been investigated by the Airport Commission based on detailed evidence. That's simply wrong. Sixth, GAL dismisses the Manchester multi-storey car parking block parking for two misconceived reasons that we've explained in our evidence. First of all, it says about the closeness to the green belt, and secondly, the closeness to the terminals. As a matter of fact, the closeness to the green belt is comparative, but in any event, GAL's point fundamentally misses out the elephant in the room, namely that with the southern runway, there will be a fundamental change to the landscape and policy context of North Crawley. And putting in multi-storey car parks where there would otherwise be decked parking, it's difficult to conceive how that can be a reason for allocating more land for car parking. In terms of the distance from the terminals, multi-storey car parking in a block format is by definition not a self-park product. So the customers leave the cars at the terminal or at the entrance to the block parking area, and the cars then get driven by staff to the block parking. The fact it's further away is only an economic point, and yet there's no evidence as to the lack of financial viability of block parking in multi-storey car parks on the 81-94 hectares of safeguarded land. Seventh, GAL is seeking to perpetuate, or in fact get worse than, its current existing practice. It's not seeking to build in improvements over time to efficiency, to block parking, to robotics or anything into its assessments. All other airports which are expanding are being required to do so with efficient car parking. And that means at Heathrow, all the long stay car parking will be multi-storey car parks under the third runway proposals. And we know what is being delivered at Manchester. Why not the same for Gatwick? Eighth, we ask you please to read York alongside GAL's misinterpretation of York, because we say that in a number of respects, and it's blindingly obvious when you read the two documents side by side, that GAL is misquoting York in its approach. Ninth, GAL assumes there's just 81 hectares. We just don't understand the logic for that figure, given that 44 hectares is lost through the Gatwick Green from the 138. And 10th, and this really pulls it all together, even now, there's no attempt to demonstrate that 81 or 94 hectares is not capable of appropriately accommodating 70,000-ish cars. And the absence of evidence on that is really quite astonishing for the reasons given by Mr. Pereira. And you'll have seen in Gatwick Green's evidence that they show you a very simple exposition as to how you could save hectares and hectares and hectares just by doing what everyone else is being required to do elsewhere. So those are my 10 points, and I close with a fundamental point, and this is a point of law. We say that at this point of the inquiry, you have no evidence, never mind robust evidence, of the need to safeguard more than that which the council is proposing to safeguard. And therefore it is not legally possible to conclude that one needs to go further, even taking Gatwick's airport's at so-called evidence at its highest.
Thank you for that, Mr. Forsdick. I will anticipate in due course Gatwick Airport wishing to pick up some of the points that have been raised there. But I'll now turn to Gatwick Green. Is it going to be Mr. Pereira or Mr. Mayer?
Both of us, sir.
Okay.
Can I agree with what Mr. Forsdick has just said? I want to deal with one point about what you might call spare land, which we now know is available. Spare land, which we now know is available on Gal's own case. As Mr. Forsdick said, our response to York has set out various ways in which large areas of land can be made available. But on Gal's own case, it looks like, and I invite you to write these figures down, there's between 75 and 87 hectares not justified for safeguarding. I'm going to deal with 35 hectares of that, and among the points Mr. Mayer makes, he'll deal with the others. The 35 hectares is the employment land. The other land, 40 to 55, is what comes about when the 26,000 odd car parking space error, a change in circumstances, again, is accounted for. But I'm going to deal with the 35 hectares. And the starting point for this is Gal's York response. At paragraph 2.4, it says, only land required to deliver the necessary infrastructure to support the southern runway at Gatwick Airport is included in the 2019 master plan. We know that's not true because at paragraph 5.5, it says that the safeguarded area includes 35 hectares of land for relocating businesses displaced by the southern runway, and Mr. Higgins referred to that. That's over 3/4 of the Gatwick Green allocation. And there are 4 fatal flaws in Gal's position, which I'm going to explain briefly. Fatal flaw 1, by definition, the land for relocating businesses is not necessary infrastructure. It doesn't meet the purpose that Gal says it's safeguarded land for. They're notional businesses which may exist at the time of this southern runway, we don't know. Fatal flaw 2, safeguarding land for employment relocation sites fails the policy tests in safeguarding under the framework. We've set out the policy in our Matter 5 reps, paragraphs see section 2, and especially paragraph 2.3, which refers to the need for safeguarding for critical infrastructure. Fatal flaw 3, the 34 hectares for employment uses is not deliverable by GAL because they have no legal powers to secure employment relocation land. It's not deliverable by GAL because they have no legal powers to secure employment relocation land. Let me explain why. The southern runway would need to proceed by way of a DCO. A DCO can only be for the NSIP itself and associated development, so the infrastructure projects, the southern runway, everything else must be associated development. And relocation sites for employment land are not, on any basis, associated development. Guidance sets out 2 important policy tests. One is associated development should support the construction or operation of the project. Well, relocated employment land is not necessary to support the construction or operation of the project, or address its environmental impacts, and it's not mitigating environmental impacts. Secondly, development cannot be associated development if it's only purpose is to subsidise the development. And of course, the purpose in having land to relocate employment sites is to help GAL mitigate its compensation bill. That's not a legitimate purpose for associated development. So those 35 hectares cannot be included in a DCO either to change the use of land to employment or for the purpose of compulsory acquisition. Fatal flaw 4, and this is important, GAL's employment land justification for the 35 hectares essentially concedes the principle of allocating employment land here and most of the area. GAL is saying to you 35 hectares of land at Gatwick Green should be set aside for employment uses. It's just that they want them for potential future displaced employment, not present day employment actually needed now in Crawley. And what they're really saying to you both, sirs, is we, GAL, can reserve this land that may never be needed for potential employment uses, but you, sirs, cannot allocate this land for current employment uses needed now. I said in December the case is brash, that's another example. It's obvious where the public interest must be struck, given this position. And I just conclude before handing over to Mr. Mayor. It's a shame, isn't it, that having acknowledged now its errors and the flaws in Arup, that GAL haven't come to the inquiry or the examination and just said, actually, we accept it's not justified, and we support the allocation, and let's work together. And we hope that day will come. I hand over to Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Sez. I'd like to take us through some of the numbers. Some of the points actually have been made by Mr. Forsdick. I'll try not to repeat, in the interest of time, but just to sort of try and explain some of the numbers and help clarify the position. The response here picks up on the paper that's been submitted by Gatwick Airport in response to York, with the extension of time they requested, submitted in December. And there's a few points within there that need to be sort of addressed. There are errors and omissions, and I think some of these are corrections that Gatwick have freely admitted to, sort of incorrect numbers being used previously, and hence the errors and the implications of those errors. So the first one is one of the significant ones. 26,280 spaces they described as being the legal or the off-airport parking that they don't intend to re-provide within the safeguarded land. That's a significant number of spaces. Now that number is actually dates back to the 2014 master plan, and we know that that's not actually correct today, because the York paper clearly states that that number is actually closer to 20,000 spaces nowadays, where some of these off-airport spaces, the illegal ones, have been removed over time. Either way, it's a significant number. And just to translate some of these things into areas, to put it into context, I'll use a simple metric here of multiplying the number of spaces by 20 square metres per bay. And the reason for that is that's the number that's agreed to by Mont MacDonald, by York and by Gatwick Airport. That's the size allocated for a conventional car parking space. So very simple calculation, 20,000 square metres, 20,000 spaces, 20 square metres each is 40 hectares. So the off-airport parking alone accounts for an amount of land that's roughly equivalent to the Gatwick Green site. That's just the first point. The next point is the updated calculation of demand. Now, the updated calculation of demand in tables 1, 2, and the associated clauses 3.1 section. There's a lot of numbers there, and they can perhaps be misleading. It's not completely transparent how all of the numbers have been calculated, but if I just draw out some of the key numbers for you, I think that helps to sort of emphasise the important points. So we see in the bottom right-hand corner of Table 1, the starting figure, 95,750 spaces, total number of spaces needed, which, as they've admitted previously, 26,000 of those, or 20,000 of those, are already provided off airport. That's the starting point, and that's consistent with the 2014 master plan, and it's also consistent with GAL's representations made in 2021. In the clauses below that, however, it describes that actually, once you take into account the off-airport parking spaces, 69,470 is actually the number they need to provide on the safeguarded land, which is why we've heard 69,000 mentioned earlier today. The updated calculation in Table 2 suggests that with some slight changes in time, what's happened between 2012 base data in 2019, that reduces to 68,000 spaces. And that's only a minor reduction of 1,500 spaces. And the GAL paper quite clearly states that because that's a very modest reduction, that only translates into about 3 hectares, it's not very significant. There's a bigger point, however, that's been overlooked there. Although the updated calculation is only 1,500 spaces or 3 hectares, the previous calculation that was submitted in the 2021 paper, and particularly in the ARAP appendix to that paper, was using the 95,750 spaces to justify why 138 hectares was required. So in practice, the correction here should not be 3 hectares. It should be allowing for the difference between 95,000 spaces and 68,000 spaces. And incidentally, of course, 68,000 spaces is very similar to the number that York positioned in their paper of in the order of 65,000 spaces. What that means is, in effect, that Gatwick have conceded the demand point to York as being correct. So that's the significant sort of overview on those numbers. There are a few other points that sort of add to that. Mr. Forsdick sort of questioned why the safeguarded land within the local plan is 94 hectares, with the Gatwick Green site allocated. And yet Gatwick are sort of using in their calculations a figure of 81 hectares. And that's because they've described 13 hectares as being unsuitable. 13 hectares being the plots of land that they argue unsuitable because they're longer to access, even though they're in the same place and the same distance away from the terminals. And maybe awkward shaped sites that you can't easily use for car parking. Now, I think we would challenge that. And the reason I do so is that 13 hectares is a large amount of land. You look at a block parking solution, which needs about 13 square metres each because it's 50% more efficient, and you can actually fit 10,000 cars in those plots that Gatwick say are unsuitable. And I think Gatwick wouldn't necessarily have conviction in that view that they can't use those sites, because if they were challenged or tested on that point and said, are you prepared to give them up? Are you willing to forfeit them and not safeguard them because you can't use them? I think they would probably change their mind and say, no, actually, we do want to keep that additional 13 hectares of safeguarded land. The next point is to do with block parking. As mentioned by Mr. Forsdick, 23,900 spaces of block parking from 2014, now described as being a third, is passenger preference. But Table 3 indicates that actually current practice is 45%, if not more, when you allow for short stay. That also is quite a significant number of car parking spaces, and you look at the different density, to your third point around the format of parking, you look at the different density of that as block parking as opposed to conventional, and do the calculations and say how much land does that translate into, and the answer is between 16 and 18 hectares. So that's a significant amount of land on top of the numbers we've heard about earlier. So there's a number of points there around areas, and I'll come back and sort of summarise those perhaps at the end. But the next point is actually one that's less numbers related, it's more about consistency. York pointed out that there's a lack of consistency between what Gatwick are doing with the Northern Runway project in their DCO and what they propose to do with the Southern Runway Master Plan from 2014, and Gatwick did seek to address that point in their response, but they haven't really addressed it in full. So this is an omission rather than an error. The example that Gatwick provided was one of staff parking, and they demonstrated the calculation in both methods and said actually, although slightly different numbers of staff, the method is consistent, the numbers are consistent, and in the example they gave, they're absolutely correct. The inconsistency, though, that you're referring to is not necessarily that staff parking calculation, but the bigger picture. And the bigger picture here is that to achieve 80 million passengers per year, Gatwick are intensifying car parking within existing land very effectively, pioneering the world of robotic parking and techniques like that, leading the industry in many ways, and managing to achieve that spatial efficiency. Then to go to 95 million passengers per year with the southern runway, which is only a small increment further, they are looking at the compulsory acquisition of an enormous 138 hectares, which seems like a departure or a change of direction. And so the inconsistency that you're referring to is this illogical backward step of spending many years intensifying car parking, which we've seen going on in all of the recent projects over the last decade and in the DCO, and then suddenly trying to revert back to a surface parking, which seems like there doesn't seem to be a logical sense to that, and it doesn't seem to be a justification for needing all of that land. So that's some of the key points. Now, the last major point that I'd like to make is one just about the biggest emission of all of them, which Mr. Forsdick did mention, which is taking a parking number and driving it, conceding the demand point to York, and then not taking the final step of translating that into how much land does that actually mean. And so this is not really addressed in the GAL response, and the reason it's not addressed is they've said because there's only a minor reduction in demand, we don't really need to redo the calculation. Clearly, we still need the full 138 hectares. So the mistake here is that how do we get to 138 hectares? If we go back to that simple formula I described earlier, and we take 69,000 car parking spaces, which is actually the old number, not the current number, and we multiply it by 20, coincidentally, it comes out with 138 hectares. So that would suggest that for the current parking demand, you would have to have nothing but surface parking to fill up the full 138 hectares of land that Gatwick would like to retain as safeguarding, which clearly is what's shown on the sketch in Plan 20 that was referred to earlier by Mr. Norwood. That doesn't take into account the block parking that we've just discussed and all of these other area allocations. If we turn that equation on its head and look at it the other way around, if we say the current local plan actually has 94 hectares, or even if Gatwick were willing to forfeit the 13 hectares that are unsuitable, 81 hectares, and we reverse the calculation and say what density do we need to achieve the 68,000, the answer is it's about 12 to 14 square metres per car parking space. And what does that mean? That means block parking is the right density. It means one level of decking is the right density. So there are numerous solutions here that can get to that very easily. We don't even need to go as far as multi-storey car parks, or even following the Manchester example, block multi-storey car parkings. Even with just very simple solutions that Gatwick are already employing today in a lot of their long stay car parks for South Terminal, for North Terminal, we get to the right density. So conscious of time, if I just wrap up with a very quick summary.
Sorry to interrupt your flow, Mr. Mayor, but just on this particular point around densities, is there anything further you wish to say? Because part of the GAL submission is we kind of need to look at things like circulation, space, access, potentially biodiversity, net gain, all of these things. The figures you've just quoted seem to me to be just a kind of this is a...
Yeah, I can address that point actually. It's something I was going to come to at the end, but it's worth mentioning now. 20 square metres per space for conventional parking is actually an agreed figure. Now, if you think about it, you have a large field full of thousands of car parking spaces. That 20 square metres isn't just the actual parking bay itself, that includes the circulation routes. So that includes circulation within the parking area. And there are a few other additional bits of land. Actually, Gatwick do talk about the net to gain figure of the fact that you don't just fit car parking in the field. There's actually probably a hedge or a very small amount of landscaping around the perimeter, and there's probably a couple of ticket barriers. But if you think about a field full of 1,000 car parking spaces and 2 or 3 car parking barriers to allow access, that net to gain ratio is minuscule. It doesn't fundamentally change the equation of how much of the space in that field gets used for car parking. So that's not very significant. On the point around environmental considerations, like biodiversity net gain, this is a new part of the planning regulation process of maintaining biodiversity. Actually, if you put in multi-storey car parks and use less land, you are displacing less natural green foliage that you have to, to maintain a net gain of biodiversity. You actually need to do less increasing hedgerows or offsetting off-site. If you went for extensive surface parking, you're actually putting a lot more tarmac down on the ground and displacing a lot more green vegetation of what's existing fields, and you would have a huge amount more biodiversity to achieve. So actually, although biodiversity is a consideration for multi-storey car parks, it's even more of an issue for surface car parking. So just to sort of wrap up some of the numbers that we've just been talking about, I think my key summary would say we've got 40 hectares of land off airport approved. We've got 3 hectares that has come from the updated calculations. We've got 13 hectares that Gatwick don't intend to use because they're unsuitable. We've got a further 16 hectares coming from the block parking. That all adds up to something like 70 hectares of land that are not required for car parking. And we've got the slightly illogical reduction in density. We're not looking here for any innovative solutions or unprecedented work from Gatwick. We're looking for conventional parking solutions to be adopted within a reasonable amount of land. Yeah, so that's 70 hectares coming purely from the parking numbers, the 35 hectares that James mentioned earlier regarding re-providing Manor Royal commercial developments. And clearly the numbers are not stacking up here. I think the last point I would make is that Gatwick are making the point that the Southern Runway project would not be able to operate because of an insufficiency of car parking. That's the case for needing the full 138 hectares. And I think we can see quite clearly that firstly, you can provide adequate car parking for the Southern Runway to operate, and that it doesn't need 138 hectares. And if they didn't have the 138 hectares, would they be able to operate a Southern Runway extension to the airport? I think very clearly they could. So I think that's all of the points I was going to make. There's a couple of minor references, but I think those are sort of secondary, and in time constraints we'll save those for another day.
Thank you. Well, we'll see where we go. There might not be another day, but I mean, what I would say to everybody is obviously you've made written submissions. Those are before us. So I hope that Gatwick Green have had sufficient time there to put across and articulate their key points. I did indicate I'm mindful, Mr. Rees, on behalf of WT Lamb, you've also made submissions following the York aviation paper.
Yes, thank you, sir. I don't intend to go through parking numbers in detail. I don't think I could have put that any more eloquently than Mr. Mayor on behalf of Gatwick Green. What I did want to say, and I will keep this brief, is I think it's what the practical impacts of this are that are quite concerning to us, and trying to explain this to my clients who own a small area of land within that missing section of Gatwick Green. That as things currently stand, this is a 13 hectare parcel of land. It's 9 hectare parcel of land that in effect will be surrounded by, if everything proceeds as is, it will be surrounded by employment uses on north, east and southern sides, and then the airport on its other side. It will in effect be of little use to anyone except for as part of something more comprehensive, in which case it can add to and actively contribute towards some of those shortfalls that we spoke about previously in November. I won't go into great detail on that. That's for your separate consideration. But it is, from our perspective, the practical impacts of what this small, obscure piece of safeguarded land will mean for the landowners and how they try to operate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rees. And I've read in your paper your kind of calculations of what you think the amount of land would be required for to meet parking demand. So those are before us. Okay, I think that's I've heard now in sequence from those who are largely certainly the council saying what it has submitted is a sound plan. So I'm now going to turn to Gatwick Airport. I don't know in which order or which sequence I'm going to hear from in terms of why the submitted plan is unsound, and we need to, or the plan would still need to continue to safeguard this land east of Balcombe Road to meet parking demand as part of integral to the second wide-spaced runway project. So Mr. Ellis first.
Yes.
Or, yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
I can, thank you.
Thanks, so I'm going to start by covering some of the key points in relation to matters 4 and 5, specifically around the future parking levels, which we've been talking about, and some of the effects since 2004 Airport Master Plan, and the accommodation of parking in the safeguarding land. Then my colleague Richard Higgins, who's the Surface Access Lead for Gatwick, will provide commentary on the parking operations and the applicability of the parking types. So the first document, which has been referenced already, which is the Gatwick Airport response to the York Aviation paper, is the first one which we're going to go through. Just as overview, the Airport Master Plan included consideration of the airport as a single functioning campus, which we've talked about already. It's interdependent on that supporting infrastructure, which is what we maintain, including the parking and the integrated access strategy directly in the M23 spur. We do not consider that the York Aviation paper considers a sound basis for justifying the removal of the 44 hectares within the safeguarded area, and there is a robust justification for its retention as part of a cohesive master plan. Just picking up the 22, the off-airport parking point. It was not the intention of the master plan to suggest the authorised off-airport parking provision would be removed. That wasn't the case in terms of the calculations. It was and it wasn't intended to be reprovided within the expanded airport boundary. That was incorrectly referenced, but the master plan was developed correctly. Within our response to the York Aviation paper, we've provided a summary of the car parking requirements which have been discussed. Table 1, which was the calculations for the 2014 master plan, we generally agree with the numbers which have been described already. I'll just touch on the purpose of the 2019 calculations, the updates in Table 2. So they were using the same overall methodology but updated for 2019 parking provisions, staff numbers, passenger numbers, etc., and mode share information. And that was just to understand the changes and the effects of those original parking numbers. It also reflects, as has been highlighted, the baseline situation set out in the Northern Runway project, which is in Table 4.2, Chapter 4 of the DCR. This does, however, give, as has been described, a very slightly lower number. We agree with the numbers which have been said, the 68,015 spaces. Identifying that the effects of the changes since the original master plan have had little effect, and we are tracking the trajectory we originally expected. The calculation method is the same as used in 2014. It includes the factoring of existing spaces on passenger numbers, but importantly, just to pick up this point, it does and did include a significant factory down of spaces for future mode share change, which was to 60% sustainable mode share. So it did look at park and fly trips and staff trips and factored down the number of spaces required based on the mode share. The result is an on-airport long stay and staff space requirement, which, as has been picked up, we agree is around 2,200 spaces higher than the Mott MacDonald calculated 65,850. so 68,015. We need to re-provide this combination of parking lost to the airfield reconfiguration, and that's a big point in terms of the difference between the NRP and the Southern Runway scheme, is that a large area of the land is lost for this provision, and we need additional space required for supporting parking growth. We also need to provide passengers with an appropriate mix of parking products, which Richard will talk through in a bit more detail. But to do this, the area safeguarded in the previous local plan would have already required us to increase parking density by including a greater proportion of deck parking than currently exists at the airport. We have allowed for a mix of parking types to provide this provision. Short stay spaces are provided in MSCPs, which has been touched on previously. And as per Appendix A5 of the submission to the Airports Commission in 2014, some 23,900 long stay block parking spaces were assumed, and further deck parking being needed as businesses displaced by the Southern Runway relocate to the safeguarded land. In that regard, I just now will go to Table 1 of the Gatwick Green response to the York Aviation paper, which provides the summary of the parking options described, page 4. I'll give you a second. Yep. This representation includes car parking density for different scenarios and concludes there is sufficient land to accommodate the car parking requirement as well as the 44 hectares of Gatwick Green development. However, there are a number of positions which haven't been taken into account, for which I'll take you through. Number one, and clearly this has been commented by others, the allowance of 35 hectares of land in the safeguard area for relocating businesses displaced by the Southern Runway, paragraph 5.5 of REPS, and section 37 of Appendix A5 of the 2014 Airport Master Plan. The car parking density presented is the footprint only. You picked up on this point a few minutes ago. We are, clearly as the airport operator, managing what we're talking about here is 68,000 spaces and trying to get people to and from those spaces and be able to find their way to different areas, different parking types within that area. There is a requirement for supporting infrastructure space, such as vehicle access roads outside the car parks, between the car parks. There is a requirement for junction arrangements. There are requirements for walking routes. There are requirements for landscape strips. These are significant. For a typical multi-storey car park arrangement, that would normally amount to around 30% plus on the footprint area. So if one took a typical arrangement of around 50-metre deep car parking, which is kind of a 6-row car park arrangement, one would expect the block separation to be at least 16 metres, which accommodates access roads, footways and landscape strips. Now, when you're trying to provide the number of car parks we are here, that would be on either side. Just accounting for one side, that's around a 30% increase in space. Some areas, which have been touched on already, are unsuitable for car parking due to, basically this comes down to shape and footprint in paragraph 5.3 of our REPS, which is, as we start to change, the allocation space, chopping out a chunk in the middle of it in an unusual shape, produces a fractured layout which loses residual land in terms of what can be provided, particularly when we're looking at more dense parking arrangements being described in these tables. It effectively sterilises part of the site created by a fractured layout, which was the 13-hectare number which was identified previously. The fourth one is there is no recognition of the planning constraints in these options that could potentially arise when seeking to construct multi-storey and block parking in this location, be that landscape, visual impact, heritage, ecological impacts, including biodiversity net gain. Resolving these constraints could significantly increase the land requirements. So, just taking the first couple of these constraints where we've got an additional 48 hectares of land, so the 35 plus 13, where use of parking is either very limited or excluded, and then at least an additional 30% on the parking areas required for supporting access and infrastructure and for wayfinding of and operation of our car parking stock. This is before any other parking planning considerations. Applying these to the examples in Table 1 of the Gatwick Green response to the York Aviation paper. And I'm going to start actually with the combination of parking solutions, given that's where we've been talking about in the last representations, which is about the mix of different parking types, which broadly aligns with our proposed level of block parking as well within the airport's commission work. The total land would be 70 hectares, plus 30% is 91 hectares, plus the 43 is 134 hectares, i.e. the whole site before any Gatwick Green allocation. The all block parking and single decking examples following this methodology are unworkable within the total safeguarded area, and the two-layer decking example would require almost all of the safeguarded land, leaving around 15 hectares to include for resolving any planning constraints and environmental impacts which are difficult to identify at this stage. We're then left effectively with what are the more extreme examples, which are full multi-storey parking across an entire site. However, these are also, while these do leave some surplus land, they are also the ones which are most likely to have the greatest planning constraints and environmental impacts. We maintain we cannot accommodate the removal of 44 hectares from this land. The extreme options as fractured land areas are failing to recognise the operations of the airport and the need for a complete master plan, taking into account consideration of site constraints of the airport, be those landscape, heritage, ecology, and its ease of access. We maintain there's a strong rationale for having a balanced mix of car parking products available to GAL to allow it to operate its operational model and to prevent less sustainable modes of travel, providing passenger choice and flexibility during peak periods and to meet the future needs of the Southern Runway. My colleague Richard will now provide some further detail on the airport's car parking operations and the need for a balanced mix of car parking.
Thank you, David. Thank you, sir. So perhaps just to step back a second and talk a little about the existing operation. As we've referred earlier this morning, sir, in the questions relating to GAT3, Gatwick operates a mix of parking products. It currently has a balanced approach to block parking, self-park, multi-storey car parks that are a walking product, walk-to-terminal product for short stay. And this is a mix that has been existing for many, many years of operation and is typical of airports throughout the UK. And in the sense that there is sort of continued and evidenced occupation of all those types of car parking, I think it's reasonable to suggest that those are corresponding to passenger preference and behaviour. We do not see in any of the occupancy for our current products, and I can go into a little bit more detail as to how those are set up, but I shall try to be brief. So in the interest of time, there is no evidence that one type of operation is favoured over others or predominantly occupied over others. And indeed, in the material that has recently been supplied by Crawley Borough Council for the September 2023 car parking survey around Gatwick, you will note that the occupancy and availability of additional space on airport by proportion is less than the available unoccupied space off airport, which indicates that the current position that passengers and users of the airport are preferring or are appearing in greater proportions to use on airport parking versus off airport, considering the same amount of space provided in or a stable amount of space provided in each. So as I say, we have a walk-in product which is multi-storey car park self-park. We also use the multi-storey car parks to provide premium valet products where operatives from the airport will repark a customer's car. They will then walk to terminal. And then we have the remote from terminal operations, which are both self-park and block park, which require a bus transfer to terminal. In the future sort of operation that we're considering in respect to the safeguarding land, we would still have that mix of multi-storey car parks close to terminals, including the addition of multi-storey car parks close to the new midfield terminal, as would be consistent with our operation, as well as long stay car parking remote from the airport in the area to the east of the railway and to the east of Balcombe Road. Now we operate these car parks generally for pre-booked passenger purchase. In general terms, about 90% of the airport's parking transactions are pre-book, but we do operate and maintain a level of provision for what we would refer to as roll-up passengers on the day of travel or quite close to the day of travel. This is important because it reflects a level of flexibility that an on-airport provider offers to changes or disruptions either in the wider transport networks. So, for example, and regrettably this is the case in the areas around Gatwick, we do suffer from rail disruption, and as a consequence there are changes in the level of demand for car parking in response to the provision of other transport. And that's where the airport's approach to integrating its parking with the surface access strategy and provision and support for sustainable modes is key and indeed reflects the discussions on GAT3 that we had earlier on. So, we, as with many of the authorised off-airport providers, provide a sort of standard of service and the British Parking Association Park Mark standards, as do Mr North's clients Holiday Extra in terms of off-airport parking. And we are notably differentiating ourselves with some of the unauthorised parking that occasionally crops up and impacts everybody. There's been reference to a sort of a difference in the amount of block parking that's been assumed or quoted, and I think Mr Mayor made reference to the quoted approximately 1/3 of spaces which are noted for block parking in the Airports Commission work, and the September 2023 figure which shows 45% of the overall on-airport spaces as block park. I think it's worth pointing out that if we compare the actual numbers of spaces being quoted for those two percentages are actually 23,900 as representing 1/3 and 17,500 spaces as representing 45%. So that needs to be considered in the context of the overall available spaces and spaces being used at the current time, as opposed to the spaces that were in operation back in 2019 for the master plan and indeed for 2014. I'd just like to come on now to the need for flexibility in our operations and indeed the way in which on-airport parking is different and differentiates itself from off-airport parking. Off-airport parking, as Mr North commented this morning, operates either as a park and ride offer, where the customer goes from an off-airport site and is transferred by bus to terminal, or as a meet and greet operation where an operative from the airport provider will meet the client on our forecourts or in a multi-storey car parks and will take the vehicle from them and park them remotely. And the airport operates similar provision in respect of its long stay car parking remote from terminals with a bus connection into the terminal. Admittedly, comparing on-airport and off-airport operation, the on-airport provider is often, although not exclusively, a quicker and shorter journey from the long stay car parks to terminal.
So just to interrupt you, sorry, Mr. Higgins, is this part of a submission from Gatwick that you want to carry on business as usual in terms of parking provision, and therefore that's the justification for the full extent of the land? I'm not quite...
Apologies, I shall get on to that point if I may, and I'll do that rather quicker than I have been doing. That's perhaps the easiest
Okay,
thing
I just want to be clear on what the evidence you're giving, and it's...
What I'm pointing out is that we are not currently a surface car park only operation. That was never assumed, and indeed all the evidence indicates that we would transfer and relocate the existing car parking, which includes block parking, decked parking and surface parking, into the area of the safeguarding land. And indeed the amount of car parking that we would need to relocate as a result of the master plan is around 82 hectares, just moving like for like. So just as a starting point, to lift what we have today and move it to the safeguarding area is approximately 82 hectares. Now, as others have commented on, we have sort of considering, we do consider the opportunities to increase the density of our existing car parking, and that is something that we would naturally expect to do, and indeed is what we've done in recent years, and is proposed in the Northern Runway project. Block parking and robotic parking, which has been referred to, provide a similar level of efficiency, of space efficiency. We've used real life examples and analysis to try and measure the actual sort of outturn saving from robotic parking in view of our interest in developing that. It's perhaps not quite as attractive as some of the marketing material from the providers is concerned, but certainly it's similar to the block parking level. So in terms of providing that blend, that mix of operation, we would be expecting to do something for, sort of similar and effective within the safeguarding area. It does require, as Mr. Ellis has pointed out, considerable additional infrastructure in order to provide access to those sites, which obviously currently do not have such supporting infrastructure or access. And I think that's something that I would compare and contrast with the examples which have been given by York Aviation and Mott MacDonald for both the Manchester example, which is an existing site on airport close to the terminal, which had existing infrastructure around it, and indeed the examples which are proposed as part of the Heathrow third runway expansion, which are also located close to existing infrastructure. I should also like to point out that and this isn't in material in evidence, so apologies, I'll just highlight this, but also draw attention to where the information can be found, is that the Heathrow examples, which talk about a similar intense, large consolidated multi-storey facility, are located in the June 2019 consultation material provided by Heathrow Airport on two sites of approximately 26 hectares and 21 hectares individually, and they're relatively sort of homogeneous. One is a sort of a square or rectangular looking site. It's a very sort of well-defined single site. That is not, or that would not be available to to Gatwick were the Gatwick Green proposal to come forward, because the area for safeguarding would be so fractured as to lead to considerable additional requirements for infrastructure, difficulties for access, much smaller components of parking as indicated by Mr. Ellis, such that some of those examples that are quoted would not be practical. I would also note that the Heathrow proposals do not limit their parking to those two sites, but there are also additional surface car parking sites identified in their proposals, amounting to approximately another 20 or so hectares. I will just sort of pause there, if I may, and perhaps just introduce colleague Mr. Hunt with respect to the land area question, and indeed this issue of the sort of fractured and less accessible nature of the resulting area, if that's okay.
Hear from Mr. Hunt, and I think it's Mr. Norwood, and then we're probably going to have to look again at the timetable. I think we're going to run out of time today for everything, but we'll carry on this discussion. Mr. Hunt.
Thank you, sir. Andy Hunt on behalf of Gatwick Airport. Just two short points relating to the new numbers submitted by the Council in the pre-Christmas modifications. The first is obviously a change to the employment land need. Well, I think 4.2 hectares has been added because the base at Fleming Way has been built out. I have a minor query. I don't think that's occupied, and therefore, to my mind, it still contributes to, could potentially contribute to future need. But I think the wider point is, even if you add 4 hectares on, you're still only at 17 hectares in terms of that defined need. At the session before Christmas, you had a lot of evidence, in particular on behalf of Gatwick Green, but that was about footloose demand, which is set out in their hearing statement on matter 4. Very clear that they are regional and national requirements, not that need figure. So the Council has based its need assessment on a jobs growth trajectory. That's the 17 hectares. And that brings me to the second change, which is part of the planning obligations policy in the annex. The Council has reduced its estimate of current employment down from 100,000 to 85,000. Now that's down from 97,000 in 2019 and is at the same level as it was in 2015. So there's been no growth in employment in 7 years, and yet the plan is based on the assumption that there will be growth and that will continue. At the hearing before Christmas, you pointed out that I was ploughing a somewhat lonely furrow around the table in terms of questioning whether there may be an overestimate and the element of certainty around that. I think I'm even happier in my position now than I was then. You don't need to look this up now, sir, but if you look at EGSM/EG/05, which is the economic growth assessments, the kind of January update, I invite you to look at the graphs on pages 4 and 5, and you can see where a current position of 85,000 jobs would put us versus those forecasts from Experian and Oxford Economics would be well below the lines. And even if you look specifically at the transport and storage sector, we are below even the 2009 starting point in that sector at around 18,000 jobs in 2022. So
I'm sorry, but is Mr. Hunt looking at a different agenda to everyone else? Because
yeah, I mean, we are, sorry, Mr. Hunt, we are obviously here for, specifically in relation to the York Aviation.
It relates. Sorry, it is coming to the point that Mr. Higgins made, which is that there is a degree of uncertainty about that level of demand and that level of need, and whether you need the 44 hectares, and if you do need the 44 hectares, whether that's what the most suitable arrangement would be to meet that need. So there is a question not simply about the quantum, but also about the format which relates to the fragmentation, and therefore the uncertainty point that we made before Christmas is particularly relevant in that context, in the light of the new numbers which the Council itself has submitted, sir.
Okay, I think obviously I was anticipating for today's session we're probably looking at things the other way round in terms of whether there was a justification or a need for a modification to safeguard all of this area of the 138 hectares to support the second runway operation. And I was through that process kind of anticipating that Gatwick Airport's position would be in terms of supporting or explaining why it felt that position was needed, rather than looking at the demand for the Gatwick Green proposal. I've heard what you've said, Mr. Hunt. I wonder if we can move on. So I think Mr. Norwood now wants to. Is it Mr. Norwood or Ms. Sargent?
Thank you. Yes, please, sir. Yes, it was just a point of in relation to what we call associated development, and that land obviously was allocated in the Gatwick Airport Master Plan for car parking, but also for those buildings that might be displaced as a result of the southern runway coming forward. And it's largely those buildings which are to the south of the existing airport. And you can quite clearly see them on the current plan. These are buildings to the south of the airport that would need to be demolished in order to accommodate the new runway. The vast majority of those buildings are indeed airport-related development. They consist of things like motor transport facilities, engineering workshops, workshops to support the hangars or the development of the airport or the operation of the airport. It also includes things like the detention centre, which is run by the Home Office. And what we were doing as part of the Airport Commission Master Plan, sir, was to try and accommodate those airport-related uses that would need to be demolished and would need to be re-provided in a logical and coherent manner with a functional relationship to the airport. Now, whether they are deemed associated development, we would obviously have to test that as part of the DCO process for that runway and the CPO case for it, and that would all be tested at the time. But all I would simply do, sir, is invite you maybe to travel down to that area to see for yourself the absolute nature of the uses down there, which are all very much related to the operation of the airport. And I think if you did a quick site visit down there, sir, maybe on your way home, you would absolutely see that all of these buildings to the south of the existing airport have a very much a functional relationship to the operation of the airport. And there was just one final point, sir, about would we be able to operate an airport with what GAL would regard as insufficient car parking. As the executive member for Gatwick Airport that runs the airport over the last 7 years, I can certainly say that if we did not have sufficient car parking, it would be absolutely horrendous for our operation. The one thing that you've got to have is you've got to have all the component parts of the airport working together. The last thing we want to do is to have people running along the hard shoulder with their suitcases because they haven't been able to park their car. And so we've got to have this relationship where all of the parts of the airport work together.
And in terms of, it is related to this, in terms of the 35 hectares that was identified for kind of displacement of airport related business. When I look at Plan 20, the airport layouts within the 2019 Airport Master Plan, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Norwood, I mean, am I missing something? Is it not identified on that plan? And certainly all the land east of Balcombe Road is identified for long stay car parking.
It's not identified on that plan, no.
Okay. Thank you. I think Ms. Sargent, I think, was indicating to come in next, please.
Very briefly, so yes. I mean, GAL's case in essence is that you've heard the numbers from Mr. Ellis, that what they don't achieve is enough capacity for Gatwick Green to come forward whilst enabling GAL to have the mix of car parking that it needs. Of course, in theory, one could, I assume, have quite a high multi-storey car park, and who knows how many spaces that might provide, but that doesn't work operationally for the airport for the reasons that Mr Higgins and Mr Norwood have explained. And I note as well that the council earlier acknowledged that GAL historically has never sought more parking than it needs. We're not in the business of trying to sterilise land for car parking that we don't need. And the only other point I wish to make, in case we don't come back again next week, and hopefully you won't have to hear again from me at all, there's been some debate from the other barristers in the room about whom the onus is upon to do what. But as you know, sir, the question is whether the Gatwick Green allocation is sound. And frankly, the one point that we haven't really discussed today, and I accept this is because we covered this off largely last time, but I do want to remind you, sir, that GAL's position is that even if it had been established that, you know, some car parking could come forward in the safeguarded land and all of that was justified, it is inconceivable that there is a justification for this 44-hectare allocation in the, as Mr Norwood has said, fragmented shape we heard last time round, dictated purely by land ownership considerations. It is inconceivable that that is a sound approach, even if in principle one were to accept that we should be lifting the safeguarding in order to provide some car parking. This is not a sound and justified way to do that.
Thank you. Before I bring in others, I'm mindful of time, but we're trying to cover as much discussion as possible. I think part of the reason asking the question to Mr Norwood prior to the mid-morning adjournment is just to kind of think through the time frame of all when this could conceivably happen in terms of a second wide space runway. I think I really want to sort of put back to GAL in terms of understand the kind of the current operating model, understand that you may at the moment have customers who expect or anticipate a certain kind of profile in parking delivery, but does GAL have anything it wishes to say in response to kind of the general points that perhaps over time things will change? I think Mr North was crystal ball gazing at the very start of this morning's session about where things could be taking us, combined with, I think, the point made by the Borough Council and others that when push comes to shove on a DCO application, there'll be an expectation on Gatwick to kind of demonstrate, you know, maximum kind of efficiency on kind of car parking provision. And whether that has, those are, I'll give GAL the opportunity, things we should bear in mind when looking at, you know, the future, potential kind of parking, land requirement, parking demand for associated with the expanded airport. Mr Higgins, please.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I will just sort of pick up on that. And there were a couple of comments earlier on about as you say, things may get to in the future. The reality is, and the evidence is, Gatwick already has one of the highest proportion of public transport use for airport passengers in the UK, certainly for a major airport. And indeed, over the last 10 to 12 years, that proportion has grown significantly ahead of most of the other airports. We continue to expect a reduction in car parking mode share, as is consistent with our approach to sustainable modes. So we will continue to do that, but there is inevitably there is a floor to the level of car parking that will be required. So gradually that decline in car parking mode share must end and stabilise, because we're not changing our catchment. We're not suddenly providing an airport only for passengers that happen to live on the end of a railway line. There will always be catchment areas that require parking as a preferred or only available choice of mode. And that is then provided for both by off-airport and specifically on-airport parking. We will use sort of various measures within our gift to encourage people onto public transport where that choice is available. In terms of how passengers may choose to travel or eventually travel to and from the airport in relation to autonomous vehicles or significant changes in overall behaviour, I think it's fair to say that that is a considerable amount of crystal ball gazing, and certainly not possible to predict or indeed to take action on in the short term, or indeed the term of well, take for example on Northern Runway DCO, because of course that is largely dictated by various developments in technology, and of course government policy around what is a precursor to autonomous vehicles, which is considerable network investment and EV strategy, which, as we know, is slipping back, sort of based on more recent government comments. So I don't think there is an expectation, and this is probably the case for all UK airports, I would contend, that the mix and the general operation of airport parking is going to change. I'm not aware that Manchester Airport are changing all of their existing car parks to the example which has been put forward for a single multi-storey block car park. I'm certainly not aware that they are adopting that model in any of their other airports, given that they are also responsible for Stansted Airport and others.
Thank you for that. I think from recollection from Gatwick's position, the evidence is the 60% mode share that was given to the airport's commissions process.
Yeah, that's correct, sir, and that's a broadly consistent approach that we have taken with our our expected ability to secure a sustainable mode of access across a number of our most recent planning documents, including the surface access strategies and Northern Runway DCO.
Thank you for that. Is there anything, I wasn't going to necessarily do this because I'm mindful of time, but I'm going to move away from Gatwick Airport. I'm going to take what's been provided in writing and what I've heard today in terms of Gatwick's airport's case and its evidence in relation to the need for this area to remain safeguarded to support the future operation of an expanded airport. I think I heard this sort of summary points from Ms Sargent a moment ago. I don't know if there's anything further from Gatwick it wishes to say, because I'm probably now going to hear in the next 15 minutes, certainly give the Borough Council an opportunity to respond. You're happy I've got the evidence you would like me to take into account? Okay, I think Mr Rees had signalled, or he's put his nameplate back up. I'll then come to Gatwick Green and invite Gatwick Green to be brief, please, and then I'll give the Borough Council final word. Mr Rees.
So it's only a very quick point. I've got the airport's operational strategy for the 2014 master plan that Arup took the 138 hectares comes from, and I think it is worth being clear that that plan actually shows. I think I counted 10 multi-storey car parks within the area. Now, obviously, that depends on height and what such, but that seemed to me to be able to accommodate a significant number of spaces. But also, there's other elements to that. I counted 12 hotels, and now that might be appropriate, but there is that future process to go through in terms of, well, actually, looking at the job that Gatwick have done in rationalising parking recently, you would have thought that there's significant scope in order to carry out a similar sort of exercise. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. So will it be Mr Mayor for Gatwick Green?
Can I make 4 short points and then hand over? Point 1, lots of talk from Gal, but no actual evidence. Point 2, Mr Ellis said it was not the intention to remove the off-airport spaces, and he said this, nor, and this was not the intention in terms of the calculations, but if you look at Arup, it's Appendix 5 to Gal's Matter 5 Statement of Case, page 1. It expressly looks at and justifies the 138 hectares in terms of providing 95,750. Indeed, it traces that back to May 2014, so it seems the Airport Commission may have been told a similar error, and we see the same reference to the 95,750 at the top of page 2. Is the land available for 95,000, etc. spaces? Point 3, there are 2 floor space measures set out in Arup. One is the 20 square metres that Mr. Mayor has referred to. The other, on page 2, first bullet point at the bottom, is an average of 14.5 square metres. Just taking the 26,000 odd and using the 20 square metres, as we know, gives 52 hectares dropping out. Using the 14.5 square metre average that Arup have used gives 37 hectares dropping out. We only need 7 more hectares for the allocation, and there's 35 hectares not needed for parking at all because it's for employment, and I've spoken about that. Fourth point, whatever else Gal says, their evidence can, I think, be characterised as unreliable. Mr. Mayor.
And there's just one technical point that I wanted to add, which is Mr. Ellis was reviewing the car parking numbers himself. He referred back to Table 1 in the Gatwick Green Limited response to the York Aviation paper from December 14th, and was describing the fact that the table describes just the car parking footprint, in which he is quite correct, and was describing that there were some additional multipliers that perhaps have to be considered and added to that. Now, the figure of 30% allowance for footways and landscaping around car parks seems to me to be a generous number. However, I don't have any evidence with me to demonstrate that's wrong for now. But what I would suggest is that 30%, even if it was true, should only really be considered around the multi-storey car parks, which obviously need a little bit of space around them because you can't put them hard up against each other. I think we could all see through common sense that a 30% allowance on the surface parking, the block parking or a single level of decking seems to be excessively generous. So it would be inappropriate to take the 70 hectares from that table and apply a 30% multiplier to everything. So I think that part of justification for why it should be 138 hectares is not quite correct. And then I did hear a further 43 hectares being added to that, and I must admit I didn't quite catch where that 43 hectares came from. So apologies for missing that point. But I think, you know, there's clearly some big additions there that aren't fully justified.
And finally, Mr. Forsdick.
Yeah, only 2 minutes there, I think. Can I adopt everything that Ms. Pereira just said? I'm also only going to comment on the subject matter of today, not everything else that's been talked about, which is just, we're focusing now on car parking numbers, so only on that. Third point, I had predicted almost all of what was said on behalf of Gatwick in my 10 points. And I note at the end of this examination and the end of this day that Gatwick asked for, almost all, I'll ask you just to read my 10 points and see the extent to which they've been answered. And the short point is they haven't even started to address my 10 points. After 5 witnesses spoke for more than 25 minutes, they haven't engaged with my points at all. But to the extent they did answer the points, that their answers are wrong. I'm going to come back to one fundamental mistake that underpins the whole in a moment, but just take what was said in respect of block parking, and my criticism was that the 33% figure had, was to be contrasted with the actual position on the ground of 45% or more. And then the answer to that was, well, let's compare the actual number of spaces. Do you remember that? But that was comparing apples and pears. That was comparing the actual number of spaces now with the actual number of spaces in 2060 after the second runway's in place. It's a completely nonsense exercise. And there isn't any answer to why Gatwick are telling you the figure's 33% when their operational manager, who's here and gave evidence to you, knows that the actual figure on the ground is 45%. that tells you the credibility of the evidence you're hearing. But the fundamental point I want to raise is that everything you've heard is misconceived in principle, because it keeps on being said that the 138 hectares built in efficiencies, that built in 94,000 and efficiencies. Sir, it didn't. On Gatwick's own case that has been made since 2014, 2019 and to the Airports Commission. Can I take you to document A5 to the master plan. PSECSMGC16, I think. It's page, oh dear, my eyesight, sorry. Page 35, it's paragraph 3.7. It's a paragraph we went through ad nauseum last time round.
Page 35.
35, yes, I think so, yeah. And you see there, if you ignore the short stay spaces, so that's the 8,500 in the 9 car parks in that table there.
Sorry, is that... Sorry.
In the table at 3.7?
I think I'm on PDF page 35. Right?
Oh, sorry. It's
document.
Paragraph 3.7, so I don't know what PDF number it is, I'm afraid.
Yep, sorry, 3.7. Yep.
Yeah, okay. If you just look at that table there, so you'll see that we're forgetting here, for these purposes, the 8,500 for short stay, because that's not what we're talking about. We know for other reasons that the 8,500 is wrong. But then if we add up the long stay blocked and the staff, you get to 95,750. Okay? So that's the same figure that effectively the ARAP were working to. I think theirs figure was very slightly out. I think it was 94,850 or whatever, but it doesn't make any difference. But look at the text. The area to the east of the railway has been designated to accommodate a consolidated surface car parking zone, as we see on the plan, so surface car parking zone, which feeds all the terminal buildings, as well as providing a safeguard for commercial developments should these be required. So the 95,000 is for a surface level car parking, the 138 hectares is for 95,000 of surface level car parking. And then some of that might be, you can read from the paragraph underneath, that some of that might be eaten into by commercial spaces, commercial development, that would then require some element of decking. You can read that in the next paragraph. But the fundamental point is that the safeguarding for which Gatwick are arguing is on the fundamental premise of surface level car parking for 95,000 cars. 96,000 cars, actually. The whole of the safeguarding has been fundamentally misconceived from day one on Gatwick's own evidence now, because it misses out the 20,000, it misses out efficiencies, and so on. So just on the 27,000 for the off airport, or the 21,000 for off airport, whichever figure you choose to go with, that just blows a hole straight through the middle of their safeguarding on their own documents. And you have my 10 other points that haven't been addressed. And so I repeat what I said in my closing of my opening bit, which there is simply no lawful basis upon which the inspectors can find that it is unsound not to allocate more, not to safeguard more than is shown in the plan. That's all my submissions.
Thank you for that. I am now going to draw a line under item 3 on the agenda. So thanks everybody for various contributions this morning. We'll obviously reflect on further on what we've heard today. There's been some helpful clarifications, and if there is anything further we do need, we'll raise that through the programme, through the programme officer, if there is additional information we need. Now, we are in the unfortunate position of having rolled over some matters from the 23rd of November to now being, I'm afraid, I look apologetically in Ardmore's direction, and also for Aurora. I'm not sure we can really do some of the things that we need to cover on the agenda any justice in about 10 minutes. So I think we're going to need more time, and it's a question of where we can kind of programme and accommodate this discussion. As I indicated, we do want to talk about specifically the boundary at Manor Royal, County Oak, and also we've got various proposed modifications to policy GAT2, and I think people have got various kind of representations and concerns about that policy. Probably got not a lot we want to say on policy DD5, but that's something else we do need to pick up. Now, there may be an opportunity possibly to accommodate this afternoon, but I'm mindful we've got other people coming for other matters. The alternative is we are going over to online sessions next week, and I don't know if that's feasible for those who've got an interest in GAT2, or whether we can kind of split things and deal with the Manor Royal, County Oak boundary today, and then deal with GAT2 and DD5 later. I mean, my sort of indicative time estimate for all of these matters was around about no more than an hour. So, Ms. Lepage.
Yeah, obviously looking particularly to Ardmore in terms of item 4, but I think our preference would be to deal with it at the end of this afternoon, perhaps, because I think all parties are here today that would be interested in those matters. And I don't know how many questions you've got on the GAT2 and DD5 mods, but from our point of view, we've got very little. We've presented the mods, we've got nothing really further to say on that. We've got the agreed position with Gatwick Airport.
Okay, I mean, in terms of obviously this afternoon, I think at Gatwick Airport with us this afternoon in relation to policy ST4 and the area of search, I mean, there may invariably be some overlap because we're probably in the same geographical area, so we could weave it in that way. From Aurora Properties, are you able to join us this afternoon, or are you on a sort of fixed time that you can?
No, I can join this afternoon. I don't know who else has got comments on GAT2. Has anyone else got any reps on GAT2?
I was potentially going to obviously invite the council to explain. It's got proposed modifications. I think maybe Gatwick Airport may wish to comment. I know they've separately indicated their support for those, but
sorry to interrupt, but in the hope of reassuring you and everybody else, I don't think we'll have much to add to what we've said in writing on the rest of this morning's agenda.
Okay, what I'm going to suggest. Right, this is.
Sir, sorry, could I?
Yep.
Just to say, I would be hopeful, just to pick on Mr. Lepage's point, that we might be able to fold up the item 4 at least on your agenda into this afternoon's discussion, because there is some overlap, and I think with a bit of thought in the half hour that we might have for lunch by the time we stop, we might be able to accommodate that, and then perhaps take stock at the end of the day, if that's acceptable.
What I was also going to suggest is when we return from lunch, I'll be indicating a 2 o'clock resumption. If we deal with policy GAT2 first and DD5, if there isn't extensive discussion on that, we'll be focusing on the council's proposed modifications. I think that would still leave us sufficient time to pick up the other then to segue straight into the transport issues without too much delay, and then hopefully weave in the Manor Royal County Oak issue when we're sort of looking more widely at policy when we're sort of similarly talking about policy ST4 in that sort of area as well. Okay, well, we may end up sitting slightly later than we envisaged. On that basis then, for Aurora, if we're back at 2 o'clock, we'll pick up GAT2, we'll then move into transport, and it may take just a little bit longer this afternoon. Okay, on that basis then, we'll have an adjournment for lunch. If we can please be back for 2 o'clock, please, and we'll resume the discussions. Thank you.
Hello.